It started quieter than I expected. The city at night is never truly silent, of course, but there's a difference between ordinary night sounds, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, and the kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat feel deafening. That first night on patrol, I felt it press against me like a weight, a subtle pressure that crawled under my skin and refused to leave. I remember stepping out of the car, the tires crunching softly over gravel in the empty lot behind the precinct. The streetlights flickered overhead, one bulb buzzing lazily, casting a long, thin shadow across the cracked asphalt. Everything seemed still, almost too still, the kind of stillness that makes you question whether you're really alone, or if something is just waiting for you to notice it. I had been on day shift before, but nights felt different, heavier, like the city had a pulse I couldn't feel, a rhythm I wasn't allowed to know. My first call was routine, a check on a street that had been reported for late-night disturbances, mostly noise complaints and occasional vandalism. Nothing serious. At least, nothing the dispatchers told me. But as I walked down the sidewalk, the fog rolling in from the river made the streetlights feel distant, like the world was shrinking away from me. I pulled my jacket tighter, the collar scratching my neck, and I told myself to focus. You focus on the work. You don't focus on what might be out there. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I almost ignored it, a soft scraping, like fingernails dragging across concrete. My eyes darted up and down the street. Nothing, just the empty row of buildings, their windows dark, their doors shuttered. I told myself it was a branch brushing against a fence. That was logical. Trees scrape against things all the time. But then, a second sound followed, this one closer. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost human. Or maybe not. My stomach dropped. I picked up my pace, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. My radio was quiet, the static crackling only when I adjusted it, as if even the devices couldn't maintain a connection to this part of the city. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the kind that makes your hair stand on end, and I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. The fog thickened around me, curling in tight against the walls, hiding corners I thought I knew. Then came the smell. I can't describe it easily, because it wasn't just one thing. It was metal rust, wet soil, something burned but far enough away that it wasn't dangerous. It carried on the wind, coming in short bursts as if whatever belonged to it was moving, coming closer and then retreating again. I spun around, trying to locate it, but the fog swallowed everything. My own footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the empty walls like someone else was walking with me, keeping pace, waiting. I told myself to shake it off, to focus on the patrol route. That's what I've been trained to do. Check the streets, record anything unusual, report it. But every step felt heavier. The concrete beneath my boots seemed harder, sharper. I tried counting the blocks, but the numbers slipped in my mind, and I realized I had lost all sense of distance. The street looked the same, no matter which way I turned. Shadows pooled in doorways and under fire escapes, and even when I focused, I could swear they moved just enough to avoid direct view. A sudden sound made me freeze, a low groan, half animal, half human, carried in the wind. I want to convince myself it was a stray dog or maybe the old building settling, but it didn't make sense. It didn't belong, and yet I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was here, watching, waiting. I reached for the flashlight strapped to my belt, clicking it on and off to preserve battery. The beam cut the fog in a thin line, illuminating graffiti on the walls. The trash bins upended, the plastic bag rolling across the asphalt like it was alive. I swung it slowly from left to right. Nothing, no movement, nothing that should have been making those noises, nothing that could explain the smell that lingered now closer, tangling in my hair and clothes. I remember a small voice inside my head, rational, logical, telling me this was normal. The city at night has sounds. The city at night has smells. You walked these streets 100 times and never been afraid. But the other voice, the one that whispers when you're truly alone, laughed softly, almost mockingly. It told me that I wasn't alone, that this street, these empty buildings, these flickering lights, they weren't empty at all. I tried speaking aloud, as though that would assert some kind of control over the situation. "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice sounded then weak, swallowed by the fog. No response. Just a faint scraping again, closer now, circling behind me, but never revealing itself. My pulse hammered in my ears. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run back to the safety of the car, the warmth, the noise of the radio. But something kept me moving forward, step by cautious step. There was a moment, just for a second, when I thought I saw it. A figure, thin, hunched, standing under a lamppost at the far end of the street. The light was weak, buzzing, flickering. When I blinked, it wasn't there. My stomach churned. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was tired, hallucinating. But the scraping sound didn't lie. It was moving closer. I rounded a corner into an alley I hadn't expected on my patrol route. The fog here was thicker, clinging to my clothes, muffling the distant city sounds. My boots scuffed over wet leaves, and I could feel a pressure in the air, a cold that wasn't just a night. My flashlight caught something shiny on the wall, a smear, dark and glistening. I stopped, staring. Could be paint, could be oil, could be blood. I didn't want to know. My stomach twisted. I thought about calling dispatch, telling them something didn't feel right, that maybe another unit should come by, but my radio crackled weakly, then fell silent, leaving me with only the sound of my own movements and that constant, deliberate scraping. Each step forward seemed to echo louder, as though announcing me to whatever was here. And then I realized the sound wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead, just around the corner I hadn't yet reached. I froze. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight tighter. Every rational thought fled. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. I could almost hear my own heartbeat, thudding unevenly, and every nerve screamed that whatever was making the sound was close enough to reach out and touch me if it wanted to. I swallowed, tried to calm myself, telling myself this was still a city, still a street, still just a patrol. But the thought fell hollow. I stepped forward. The scraping stopped. Complete silence. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, a whisper, so soft I barely caught it, as though someone were speaking directly into my mind. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around. Nothing. Just fog and shadows. My breath came fast, shallow. The rational part of me wanted to run, but my feet were rooted, caught between fear and disbelief. The whisper came again, a little louder, echoing in the empty alley. I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, overlapping, indistinct. And then, with a sudden rush of wind, the fog swirled around me, and I felt, for the first time that night, something brushed past my shoulder. Something cold. Something alive. I don't remember exactly how I got back to the main street. I remember running, the flashlight swinging wildly, my legs moving faster than my brain could process. The sounds followed me, just at the edge of hearing, circling, taunting. I made it back to the patrol car, slammed the door, locked it, and sat there, shaking, listening as the city seemed to settle back into normal night sounds, as if it had been holding its breath all along. But I knew better. I knew that the streets weren't empty. I knew that the scraping, the whispering, the shadow and the fog, it was out there, waiting, and I had just barely caught its attention. I sat in that car for the rest of my shift, flashlight in my lap, radio dead, staring at the streetlights that flickered like weak stars. I didn't hear the scraping again, not until much later, and even then, I could swear it was closer than it had been before. And when morning finally came, pale and cold, I realized the truth. The night hadn't ended. Not really. Not for me. It was still out there, watching, waiting for the next patrol, the next solitary officer, the next first night. And I knew I would never walk these streets the same way again. I had been on the road for over an hour when the call came through. Dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, like they had no idea what they were sending me into. Reports of a suspicious figure at the intersection of 5th and Elm. Multiple witnesses say it disappears when approached. My stomach tightened. I've handled strange calls before, but there was a weight to this one, a subtle heaviness, like stepping into a fog that doesn't just cover the streets, but presses down on your chest. When I arrived, the street was blanketed in thick fog, the kind that swallows light and sound alike. Street lights struggled against it, casting fuzzy yellow halos that barely reached the ground. The air smelled damp and earthy, with just a hint of something metallic, like iron left out in the rain. I could barely see a few feet ahead, and the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city waking somewhere far away. The first witness was an older man standing near the curb, his coat pulled tight against the night chill. He shook when he spoke, pointing down the street. It was right there, just standing, watching. Then it wasn't. I swear, I don't know where it went. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting it to reappear behind me. I nodded slowly, keeping my voice neutral. I'll check it out. Stay here. But even as I said it, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. I didn't feel like checking. Not really. I started down the street, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the fog. The pavement was wet, reflecting the dim lights like murky water. Each step seemed louder than the last, echoing against the empty buildings. I remember the older man's words. Then it wasn't. That simple phrase looped in my mind. The idea that something could be there 1 second and gone the next was unnatural. My gut told me that whatever it wasn't bound by the rules I trusted. I kept my pace slow, careful not to make any sudden moves. I tried to listen, but the fog swallowed sound the way it swallowed light. Then, almost imperceptibly, I caught it. A shift in the air, a vague movement at the edge of my vision. I spun my flashlight toward it. Nothing, just fog curling lazily against the buildings. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my eyes adjusting too slowly, letting imagination fill the emptiness. But deep down, I knew better. The street twisted at the next intersection, and I paused. The fog seemed to thicken here, curling around the corners, hiding the far side of the road. And there it was, or at least something like it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just inside the mist. I squinted, trying to make out features, but there was only darkness beneath the hood, no discernible face, nothing human in shape beyond a rough outline of shoulders and arms. My heart picked up pace, but I told myself to stay calm. It was probably a homeless man or someone playing a prank. Nothing supernatural, nothing real. I stepped closer, every footfall deliberate, trying to close the distance. And then impossibly it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next gone. My flashlight swung wildly, cutting through fog and shadow. The street was empty. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and unsteady. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. Hello? You there? No answer. Not even the sound of retreating footsteps. Just the wet silence and the faint metallic smell in the air. I walked further, circling the intersection, scanning each corner, trying to convince myself it had moved away. But the fog seemed thicker here, unnaturally so, curling around me, pressing close. I felt exposed, as if I were in the center of something alive, a presence watching from all sides, yet impossible to see. Every instinct screamed to leave, to retreat to the safety of the car, but my pride, or perhaps my stubbornness, kept me moving forward. I reached the corner and stopped again, and then I noticed it. Footprints, just a few, barely visible in the damp asphalt, leading into the fog. They weren't human. At least, they weren't normal. The stride was too long, too smooth, almost floating, like whatever made them barely touch the ground. I followed them a few steps, hesitant. My own shadow stretched long and thin beneath the flickering streetlight, but it felt wrong somehow, disconnected from me. I heard a whisper then, faint, almost drowned by the fog, yet distinct. You shouldn't follow. It wasn't the voice of a person, not entirely. There was a hollow echo to it, a strange resonance that made my teeth ache. I froze, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles whitened. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Wind? Echoes bouncing between buildings? But it didn't sound like that. It sounded aware, watching, deliberate. I forced myself to keep moving. The footprints led to another alley, narrower, darker, swallowing the weak light from the street. I hesitated at the entrance. A part of me wanted to turn back, to let the night keep its secrets. But something deeper, darker, compelled me forward. My hand trembled as I swung the flashlight down the alley. The walls were close here, covered in grime and chip paint. The fog hung thick, curling like smoke, hiding the far end completely. Then, for a brief moment, I thought I saw the figure again, just at the far end, just beyond the reach of the flashlight. Same tall, then outline, no face, no detail. I blinked and it was gone. My stomach churned. I realized I couldn't remember ever blinking faster, praying that my eyes were simply deceiving me. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, it tightened, wound around me like a rope, holding me in place. I started walking slowly down the alley, each step careful, deliberate, trying to keep my breathing steady. The fog muffled the sounds of the city, leaving only my heartbeat, loud and uneven, and the soft scrape of my boots on wet concrete. And then came the sound again, faint at first, almost dismissible, a dragging, soft, deliberate, not footsteps, something else, something following. I spun around. Nothing, just fog and walls, close enough to touch. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in my throat. The alley seemed longer than it should have been, stretching unnaturally, folding in on itself. I shook my head. That's impossible. Streets don't stretch. Buildings don't move. And yet, my sense of direction betrayed me. I couldn't tell which way I had come in, which way led out. The fog was a living thing here, curling, twisting, hiding. I heard it whisper again. This time, clearer, closer. You're here now. I froze, sweat prickling on my neck. It wasn't a voice I recognized. No human could speak like that. The words weren't just heard. They were felt, crawling into the edges of my mind, pressing against memories I didn't want to remember, thoughts I didn't want to think. I stumbled back a step, almost dropping the flashlight, and flickered wildly in response, plunging the alley into brief darkness before buzzing back to life. The figure wasn't there, not physically, but I could feel it. I could feel in the fog curling at my ankles, in the shadows pooling in corners, in the oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. My hands shook, and I realized my mouth was dry. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, like moving through thick water. The alley seemed endless, twisting impossibly, the exit hiding itself behind layers of fog. I remember thinking, with sudden, piercing clarity, that this wasn't person. Not really. Not human. This was something else. Something patient. Something that had been here long before I walked these streets. Long before the city even existed in this form. And it had noticed me. It had been waiting for someone to notice it. Waiting for me. Finally, the alley ended. I stepped into Main Street again. Fog thinning slightly. Streetlights buzzing weakly overhead. The night felt different. Thinner. Lighter. Somehow. But the tension didn't leave me. My legs trembled as I walked back to the patrol car. Every instinct screaming that I was being watched. Every nerve telling me that I hadn't seen the last of it. I got back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself it was over. But even as I stared at the fog curling lazily along the street, I knew it wasn't. It was still there, waiting in corners and shadows, at intersections I had yet to reach. The night had shown me a glimpse of something I couldn't explain, and the truth settled in my chest like ice. The fog didn't just hide things. It hit him, or whatever it was, and it would be back. I kept the engine running that night, listening to faint, eerie hum of the city around me, the fog rolling in waves across the pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling that the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. And I knew, in a way I couldn't fully describe, that this was only the beginning. I never thought I'd see something on a screen that would make me question my own mind. But that night changed everything. The precinct had a small security room, just a few monitors displaying the streets and alleys I patrolled. Normally, it was just static lights, cars moving through intersections, the occasional stray animal. Nothing worth paying attention to. But that night, I found myself drawn to it, almost like something was urging me to look. It started innocently enough. I was reviewing footage from the previous night, checking for anything unusual, just routine stuff. Then I noticed movement, barely perceptible, on one of the alley cameras. At first, I thought it was a trick of the angle, a shadow, a stray bag in the wind. But then the shadow moved in ways that made no sense. It slid along the walls without touching the ground, corners bending around it as if it were swimming through the fog instead of walking. I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. I rewound the footage, frame by frame, eyes straining in the dim glow of the monitor. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't something that could be explained by a passing car or streetlight. The figure, tall and thin, moved impossibly, corners and walls folding around it, disappearing in one frame and appearing in the next as if space itself were bending for it. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just someone playing with the fog. This was something else, something that defied the rules I knew, rules I had spent years relying on. My fingers shook as I reached the radio, tried to tell myself that maybe someone else could confirm it, someone sane. But when I called out, no one responded. The station was quiet, almost eerily so, like the night had swallowed every sound. I watched the footage for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The figure seemed aware of the cameras, moving in ways that suggested it knew exactly what was being watched. It appeared in alleys I hadn't yet patrolled, then vanished from one street only to appear in another, crossing impossible distances without a single sound. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my face, telling myself I was imagining it. I had to be imagining it. There was no way the world worked like this. But then it moved again, and this time, it looked directly at the camera. Not with eyes I could see. There was no face, but somehow it was looking straight at me. The cold sensation hit my chest like ice water. I felt exposed, seen, as if whatever this was had known I would be watching, and it was waiting for me to notice. I couldn't breathe properly. Every rational thought fled. My training, my years of experience, none of it mattered. I was just a human staring at something that wasn't human. I shut the monitor off for a moment, needing to catch my breath, needing to convince myself I wasn't losing it. My hands trembled, the kind of trembling that comes from fear, so deep it roots itself in your bones. I stared at the blank screens, the soft hum of the electronics filling the silence. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe I had been on the road too long. Maybe I was seeing patterns where there were none. That had to be it. It had to. But when I turned the monitor back on, it was waiting, not where it had been before, not in any alley I remembered seeing, but closer, just at the edge of the frame, a shadow stretching impossibly long, its presence almost tangible. I could feel it in the room, in the air, in the weight pressing down on my chest. My pulse raced, and I realized I hadn't blinked in minutes, staring at a figure that didn't belong to any world I knew. I tried rationalizing. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe some glitch in the camera. Maybe some prankster knew how to manipulate the footage. But deep down, I knew none of that could explain the way it moved, the way it seemed to wear, the way it looked at me. I felt smaller, weaker, like a child standing in the dark. My own reality seemed to wobble, the walls of the precinct room tilting slightly, my reflection in the monitor's black screen staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I remember standing up, pacing, trying to shake the dread. The room felt different, colder, the air heavier. My reflection in the monitors seemed wrong, slightly delayed, slightly off. I pressed my hand against the desk, willing myself to breathe normally, to tell myself I wasn't seeing things. And yet, I kept turning back to the footage. I couldn't stop myself. Something about that figure was magnetic, pulling me in, drawing me closer even as every instinct screamed to run. And then came the sound, not from the footage, not from the monitors, but from the room itself. A soft tapping, deliberate, almost imperceptible. I froze, my ears straining. The sound came again, closer, circling around me. My eyes darted to the ceiling, the walls, the empty corners, but nothing was there. My rational mind whispered, "It's just the building settling." But the other voice, the one deep in your chest that feels, not thinks, whispered, "It's here." I backed away from the desk, the monitors casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started, replaced by silence so thick I could feel it pressing against my eardrums. I tried to focus on something normal. Anything normal, the hum of the lights, the faint buzz of computer fans. But I couldn't. Every shadow seemed too dark, every corner too close. And the air felt alive, curling around me, waiting. I sat back down, hand shaking, and turned my attention once more to footage. The figure moved again. It was no longer constrained by alleys or streets. It appeared in spaces a camera shouldn't have seen. Rooms that were locked, corridors that led nowhere, impossible movements, bending angles, disappearing through walls and reappearing in places that didn't exist. I realized with a sinking horror that what I was watching didn't obey reality, not the reality I knew. My mind started to fracture under the weight of it. I questioned everything, what I had seen on the streets, what I had felt in the fog, even my own senses. Was I awake? Was this a dream? Had I lost control? My hands rubbed my eyes raw, trying to erase what I was seeing, but it lingered, imprinting itself on my mind like ink that refuses to wash away. Then the impossible happened. The figure moved closer to the camera, closer than any physical being should have been able to. For a moment, I swore it reached out, a long, thin hand stretching toward me, though the screen was flat and lifeless. My chair tipped back slightly as I recoiled. My heart raced uncontrollably. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, a raw, panicked energy that made me want to run, to flee the building, the city, the world itself. I forced myself to stay. I had to. I had to understand. And that's when I noticed the eyes. Or at least the sense of eyes. Not literal eyes. There was no face. But something watching, something aware. Every corner of the screen seemed alive with them, glowing faintly in the darkness, hidden but undeniably present. They weren't just watching the streets. They were watching me, following me, knowing my movements, predicting them. And the thought sank into my chest like a stone. I had been watched all along. I tried to convince myself to leave, to step outside, to breathe the night air, to do something normal, anything normal. But my legs felt like lead. My thoughts circled in endless loops, spiraling into panic and disbelief. I realized I wasn't just observing. I was part of whatever this was, caught in its presence, unable to escape its attention. The line between reality and the screen blurred. The figure on the monitor became more than a shadow. It became something that existed alongside me, in the same space I breathed, in the same world I walked through. Hours passed, though I have no clear sense of time. The figure never left the screen, never stopped moving, never blinked, and I realized I was no longer watching it. I was being watched. My reflection in the monitor's black edges seemed to twitch, my own eyes unsteady, my chest tight with fear. I leaned back, gripping the edge of the desk, telling myself I could leave, but I couldn't. I was frozen by the knowledge that wherever I went, whatever I did, the eyes would find me. By the time the sun began to rise, pale and weak, I hadn't moved from my chair. The footage had been erased, corrupted, or perhaps it never existed. But the memory remained, etched into my mind in perfect clarity. I knew, in a way I cannot describe, that it had seen me, that it had marked me, and that it would return. I left the room that morning a different person. Shadows felt heavier, corners deeper, and every reflective surface whispered that I was being watched. I tried to explain it to anyone who would listen, friends, family, co-workers, but no one understood. They saw only empty streets, ordinary alleys, routine security footage. I was the only one who had seen it, the only one who knew what the eyes could do. And some nights, when the fog rolls in thick over the city streets, I swear I see them, not just in screens, but in reflections, in corners, in the darkness that bends around reality itself. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to what I know. Some part of me hopes I'm wrong, that I've imagined it, that the world is still safe and sane. But deep down, I know better. The eyes are there, watching, waiting, and I fear the next time they focus on me, I won't be able to turn away. The night felt heavier than usual when I stepped out for my patrol. I don't know if it was because of the earlier incidents, the impossible movements on the cameras, or the feeling that something was still waiting for me in the fog, but every step felt weighted. The streets were empty, but the emptiness wasn't normal. It wasn't quiet like it usually was. It was expectant, like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to notice that I was no longer alone. I told myself over and over that it was just paranoia. I'd been trained to trust my senses, to rely on what I could see, hear, and touch. I had my flashlight, my radio, though I barely trusted anymore, and my instincts. And yet, instincts screamed that this night was different. That whatever had been in the alleys, whatever had watched me through the monitors, had followed me out into the real streets. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying to cover each block methodically. The fog curled around the buildings, hugging the street corners, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Streetlights flickered weakly, their glow barely reaching the cracked sidewalks. I kept telling myself to focus on a route, to check the addresses, to log anything unusual, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows. Always shadows, moving just enough to suggest something waiting, something patient, something watching. It happened the moment I rounded the corner near an abandoned convenience store. The feeling hit me first, a cold that wasn't from the night air pressing against my neck, crawling down my spine. I froze, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, and then I saw it or felt it. Something shifted at the edge of the light, just beyond my reach. A figure, impossibly dark, standing there as if it belonged to the shadows themselves. No features, no face, just a tall, thin shape that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I told myself to breathe, to step back, to remember the rational explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the fog. Maybe it was a trick of my eyes. But every instinct screamed otherwise. It was aware, waiting, watching, and the way the fog moved around it, curling unnaturally, bending the air in impossible angles, made me realize that whatever was, it didn't follow the rules of reality. I took a slow step forward. Nothing moved, but the presence felt closer, pressing against me, almost tangible, like the air itself had weight. My chest tightened. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted, glued to the pavement. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and uneven, and somewhere deep inside, I felt that I was too late, that this had been waiting for me since the first night I walked those streets. The figure shifted, not like a person would, not with joints and muscles, but with an almost fluid motion, bending angles, stretching in ways that should have been impossible. And then it was closer. I could feel its attention on me, though I couldn't see its eyes. That awareness was enough to freeze me in place, every hair on my body standing on end. I wanted to call for backup, wanted to speak, wanted to do anything to make it stop, but my voice wouldn't come. I tried to convince myself to look away, to retreat, but my feet betrayed me. They moved forward toward it, drawn as if by some magnet embedded in the asphalt. Every step felt heavy, dragging, as if the street itself was resisting me. The fog swirled at my knees, coiling around me, and I could swear I heard a soft whisper, almost inaudible, brushing against my mind rather than my ears. "You can't leave." Panic rose, unbidden, hot and sharp. I forced myself to stop, planting my feet firmly, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles whitened. The beam shook as I tried to sweep the figure into view, but it always seemed just beyond it, just out of reach. And then, for a fraction of a second, I thought it moved closer. Or maybe I did. I couldn't tell anymore. The fog, the shadows, the street itself, all of it had become untrustworthy, bending perception, twisting reality. I remember thinking about the patrols I'd done before, the ordinary nights, the mundane calls, and the stark contrast made my stomach churn. Those nights had been safe, predictable. This wasn't safe. This wasn't predictable. This was something else entirely. Something that had watched me from the shadows, from the monitors, and now from the very air around me. I took another step forward, then stopped again. The silence pressed in, broken only by my own heartbeat and the soft hum of distant city lights. And then I felt it, a shift in the air, something moving just behind me, brushing past, almost imperceptible. I spun around, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the fog. But there was nothing. Nothing but the curling mist and the empty street. My chest heaved, my breath ragged. And yet I knew it hadn't left. It couldn't leave. Whatever it was tied to me now, aware of me, patient and infinitely enduring. I tried speaking, voice trembling. "Who's there? Show yourself." The words sounded pathetic, hollow even to me, swallowed by the fog. No answer came, only the faint shifting of air, a subtle vibration that made the hairs on my arms rise. I realized with sinking certainty that it wasn't human. It wasn't trying to communicate. It wasn't bound by anything I understood. It was something else. Something old, patient, waiting. My mind started to wander, to memories of earlier nights, the figure in the alleys, the eyes in the monitors, the impossible movements I had witnessed. Every rational explanation dissolved under the weight of what I knew, and I began to understand something terrifying. It didn't need to touch me. It didn't need to speak. Its mere presence, its awareness, was enough to bend my mind, to make me question what was real, to leave me trembling on empty streets in the dead of night. I moved again, step by careful step, circling the block, keeping my back to the streetlights as best I could, trying to keep the shadow at the edge of my vision. The fog thickened, curling around corners, hiding alleys, bending light. I could feel it moving, though I couldn't see it, shifting with me, staying just out of reach, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. It was a predator, but not in the way I understood predators. It didn't hunt for flesh. It hunted for attention, for awareness, and I was the only thing in the street to notice. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt meaningless. The fog didn't change. The street didn't change. And I realized something else, something that made my chest tighten with dread. Even if I left, even if I returned to the precinct, the presence would remain, waiting, watching, patient. I could feel its awareness stretching beyond the alleys, beyond the monitors, beyond my patrol. It didn't end with the night. It never ended. Eventually, I found myself back at the intersection where I had first felt it. The same empty streets, the same flickering lights. I didn't try to fight anymore. I didn't try to rationalize. I simply walked, step by slow step, heart racing, knowing that whatever had been following me, watching me, marking me, was still there, not in the shadows exactly, not just in the fog. It was in the air, in the weight pressing against my chest, in the way the city seemed to curl around me, bending reality subtly, impossibly, unervingly. I got back to my patrol car eventually. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it there, just beyond vision, aware of my presence, patient and endless. The engine hummed weakly as I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. I didn't move for a long time, letting the fog swirl around the tires, letting the night stretch and contract. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, exhaustion, imagination. But my gut, every instinct of my body, screamed the truth. It was real, and it was patient. I drove home with the windows up, the radio on low, trying to convince myself that distance could protect me, but the sensation didn't fade. I felt watched. Every reflection, every shadow, every corner of my apartment seemed to twitch subtly when I wasn't looking directly at it. I lay awake for hours that night, flashlight on, scanning my room, expecting the impossible to appear. The rational part of me whispered, "You're fine, you're safe." But the other part, the part that knows, kept reminding me, it doesn't need to touch you. It only needs to exist. And it does. The night didn't end. Not really. And I knew in my bones that it never would. The night started quietly, quieter than I liked. There's a difference between the usual hum of the city after midnight and the kind of silence that makes your own heartbeat feel loud. I had been on night shifts for months, and I thought I knew what to expect. Empty streets, the occasional drunk staggering home, the low whine of distant traffic. But that night, the calm felt fragile, like a thin sheet stretched over something darker, waiting just underneath. Dispatch called me around 1:17 a.m. The voice over the radio was calm, almost mundane. Unit 4. We had a report of a screaming woman near the old industrial lot on Pine Street. Witnesses say she ran into the abandoned buildings. Over. I repeated the location back and clicked off, telling myself it would be routine. These things usually were. Kids sneaking around, someone high on something, maybe an animal trapped somewhere. Nothing serious. Nothing I couldn't handle. I drove there slowly, headlights cutting narrow beams through the fog that had rolled in from the river. The streets were empty, but the fog made them feel alive, curling around streetlights and corners in ghostly tendrils. I kept my hand hovering over the radio, ready to call for backup if things went wrong, but try and convince myself that nothing would. My eyes flicked to the shadows along the warehouses, empty, silent, yet I felt them watching, waiting. When I arrived, the industrial lot was as deserted as I expected. Paint peeling off walls, broken windows glinting faintly in the car headlights. I stepped out, boots crunching over gravel and glass. The air smelled damp, metallic, and a little sweet. Something rotting far off, but I couldn't tell what. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam trembling slightly as I scanned perimeter. No one, nothing, just buildings that had been abandoned for years, their doors chained, walls tagged with peeling graffiti. Then I heard it, a sharp scream, brief but unmistakable, echoing off the walls of the warehouses. It wasn't far, maybe 50 feet, but it was gone the moment it ended. My stomach twisted. I swallowed hard, telling myself to stay calm, to keep logical. Screams can carry far. It could have been anyone at all, but something about the way it ended too sudden, too quiet, as if someone or something had pulled it back into the darkness. I stepped forward, flashlight in hand, moving carefully along the edge of the lot. Broken crates and discarded pallets made every step uncertain, threatening to betray my presence with a loud clatter. The fog clung to the ground, wrapping around my legs like it wanted to slow me down, keep me from moving too fast. I told myself to ignore it, focus on the task, do my job, find her, calm the situation. Routine, easy. I reached the first warehouse. Its doors hung loosely on rusty hinges. The windows were smashed, darkness beyond them deep and impenetrable. My light swept over the inside. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by some distant draft. I paused, listening. Nothing, just my breathing, loud and shallow, and the faint hum of distant traffic. I told myself she had gone deeper into the lot, maybe hiding from whoever or whatever had scared her. A soft sound made me freeze. Footsteps. Quick, light and hesitant. They stopped suddenly, as if whoever was had noticed me. My hand tightened on the flashlight. "Ma'am," I called, voice low but firm. The sound of my own voice echoed strangely against the walls, swallowed by the emptiness. No answer, only silence. I took another step forward, then another. The footsteps resumed, keeping pace with me, but always just out of sight. I knew better than to look behind me. The instinct to follow the sound was there, but it was like the shadows themselves were testing me, seeing if I'd fall for the trick. I rounded a corner and found myself in a narrow alley between two warehouses. The fog was thicker here, and the smell of decay was stronger. That metallic tang again, sharp and coppery. The footsteps stopped. A faint whisper, almost like a breath, brushed against my ear. I spun around. Nothing. My flashlight beam cut through the haze, landing on empty crates and the warped wood of old doors. My chest tightened. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing heart. She was here somewhere. I told myself I had to find her. Then I saw it, a glimpse of movement near the far end of the alley. Something crouched low, hidden in the shadows. I called again, louder this time. "Ma'am, are you okay? Come to me." The movement froze, then vanished. Not like someone ran, just disappeared. My pulse spiked, sweat prickling at the back of my neck. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was the fog, the angles of light. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks. Maybe, but deep down, I knew that wasn't enough. I took a slow step forward, gripping the flashlight tight. The air felt heavier here, almost solid, pressing in from all sides. Each breath was a labor. I remembered patrols in abandoned buildings before, Broken glass, graffiti, old furniture. But nothing had ever felt like this. The emptiness wasn't empty. It was patient, waiting. I realized I couldn't tell if the footsteps I heard earlier had been hers or something else. Something watching. I rounded the last corner of the alley, flashlight shaking slightly. The scream came again. Faint, distant, desperate. But there was something wrong. The sound carried a weight, a distortion I couldn't explain, like it had been stretched, twisted by some force I couldn't name. My stomach dropped. I called her name, voice cracking. But this time the scream didn't vanish. It ended abruptly, leaving an echo that seemed to linger in my mind, pressing against my thoughts, almost suffocating. I stepped forward into the center of the lot. The fog swirled at my feet, thick and cold, curling around me. I shone my flashlight across the empty ground, scanning every shadow, every corner. Nothing moved. The scream was gone, the footsteps gone, the alley empty. And yet I could feel it, something unseen just beyond perception, watching. My pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the car, to abandon the search. But I couldn't. The thought of leaving her there, if she was real, if she was alive, made my stomach twist even more. I started calling her name again, slower this time, listening for a reply. The fog seemed to swallow my voice, carrying it off in soft waves. And then I heard it, not a scream, not a footstep, but a sound like breath. Slow, deliberate, steady, close. I spun in a circle, flashlight slicing through fog and shadows. But there was nothing. My chest heaved, my legs shaking. I wanted to run, but something held me there, rooted, facing the empty lot with all its secrets. I remembered stories I'd heard from other officers. Cases where the night seemed to twist reality, where people vanished or shadows moved on their own, where the line between fear and imagination blurred. I never believed them. Never truly. But now, standing there in the fog, hearing that breath, feeling that weight, I understood. Some nights, the city isn't empty. Some nights, the streets themselves seem alive, bending the rules, testing you, daring you to see what's really there. I finally started moving again, slow steps back toward the patrol car. The breath had stopped. The fog curled lazily around crates and walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I hadn't seen her, that I hadn't really been alone, that whatever had made those sounds was still here, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My hands were clammy, my legs heavy, but I forced myself forward, counting steps, forcing rational thought. When I reached the car, I paused, looking back at the lot one last time. Empty, quiet, ordinary again, and yet I couldn't convince myself it really was. Something had been there. Something had made the scream. Something had watched me in the shadows. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine off, flashlight on my lap, staring at the lot as fog drifted slowly across the asphalt. I didn't move until the first hint of dawn colored the sky pale gray. Even then, the image of those shadows, the impossible sound of that scream, lingered. I drove back to the station, replaying everything in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was over, that it had been a kid, a vagrant, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But deep down I knew better. Something had been there, watching, waiting, and I had come too close. I've never forgotten that night. The scream, the breath, the way the fog seemed alive. Every time I pass an abandoned lot now, or hear a faint sound in the distance, I can't help but think of her, or of whatever made her scream. Some nights, the city isn't empty, and some nights, I still hear it, whispering just beyond the reach of reason, waiting for the next patrol. The call came in just after 2 a.m. Another report, this time about noises in an abandoned house on Hawthorne Street. By now, I should have known better. Repeated nights of emptiness, strange sightings, and the lingering dread from the industrial lot made every new call feel like stepping deeper into a world I didn't belong in. Still, I went. I told myself it would be routine, that it would be nothing. But the streets were quiet in that unnatural way again, and I knew I wasn't going to find nothing. The house was at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, wedged between two buildings that leaned slightly toward it, their shadows pulling against its walls. The windows were dark, broken in places, some covered with plywood, paint peeled in long strips from the walls, and weeds pushed stubbornly through cracked pavement. My headlights cut through the fog, spilling across the yard, illuminating a broken swing swaying faintly in the wind. No one should be here, but I felt it instantly, the awareness, something in the darkness beyond the glass, pressing against me in a way that made my stomach tighten. I stepped out of the car, boots crunching over gravel and dead leaves. The fog clung to the ground, curling around my ankles as if alive, and the air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic. I checked my radio. Nothing, just the low hum of city lights far away. I gripped my flashlight tighter, taking the first few steps toward the house. Each movement felt magnified, the fog absorbing sound, leaving me with only my own breath and heartbeat. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. I pushed it gently, expecting a creak or groan, but the hinges were silent. The interior was darker than the night outside, shadows pooling in corners, swallowing the weak light from my flashlight. Dust motes floated in the beam, disturbed by the slight draft moving through broken windows. The floorboards creaked faintly under my weight. Though I couldn't tell if I was hearing the house settling or something else, I started moving through the main floor slowly, sweeping my light across the walls. The wallpaper was torn, faded to dull browns and yellows, curling at the edges. Furniture lay in ruins, a broken chair here, a toppled table there. The house smelled of rot, old wood, and something sweeter underneath, almost like decaying flowers. I tried to convince myself that this was all normal, just the remnants of a long-abandoned home. But the feeling of being watched grew heavier with every step. The staircase loomed ahead, each step growing under my weight as I climbed, the beam of my flashlight dancing across walls, ceiling, and floors. I reached the second floor, doors hanging open or missing entirely. The air was colder here, the fog thicker, curling along the floorboards, obscuring the edges of the rooms. I moved from room to room, flashlight cutting through darkness, calling out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice sounded wrong, hollow, swallowed by the house, coming back to me with a subtle echo that made me flinch. Nothing answered, nothing moved, and yet I could feel it. Awareness, presence. I couldn't explain it. My eyes kept catching movement at the edges of beam, tiny shifts in shadows, distortions in the corners. When I turned to focus, there was nothing, but the sense remained. I wasn't alone. Whatever or whoever was here, it wasn't making itself obvious. It was patient, hidden, observing that I in the corner of one room. I noticed marks on the floor, small, scuffed scratches leading toward a wall. Not deep, but deliberate, like someone had dragged their fingers along the wood, leaving subtle traces. I knelt, shining my light closer. There was nothing else, no footprints, no other disturbance, just those marks. My stomach twisted. I tried to rationalize. Maybe an animal, maybe something left years ago. But deep down, I knew it was recent, fresh, intentional. I moved carefully toward the marks, each step deliberate. The air felt thicker with every movement, heavier, pressing against my chest. I kept sweeping the flashlight, trying to catch a sign, a glimpse, something that would make sense. And then I saw it, or rather, felt it. A shadow shifted at the edge of my vision, quick, deliberate, but gone the moment I turned toward it. My pulse spiked, my hands tightened around the flashlight, and I told myself to breathe. Nothing had touched me, nothing had moved closer, but the awareness that I backed away slowly, scanning the corners of the room. The fog, or whatever clung to the floorboards, swirled, hiding more than revealing. I could feel eyes, not literal eyes, but something in the dark, following, measuring, watching. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd seen shadows before, played tricks on myself before, but the heaviness didn't leave. It pressed down on my chest, curled around my shoulders, made every instinct scream that I was intruding, that I moved to another room, hoping the feeling would lessen. It didn't. If anything, it intensified. The air seemed thicker here, fog curling like smoke, lingering even without a breeze. My flashlight caught something on the far wall. Faint scratches, deeper this time, in words, or maybe letters. They were smudged, almost illegible, but the way they clawed across the wall made my skin crawl. I leaned closer. My mind tried to explain. Graffiti? Previous tenants? But the handwriting or scrawling was uneven, frantic, urgent, like someone or something had tried to communicate in a hurry, then vanished. I swallowed hard, stepping back. The sense of being watched became almost unbearable. Every corner, every shadow, every darkened doorway felt alive, turning subtly as I moved. I realized I couldn't tell what was real and what was in my mind, and that was when I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak, almost like a sigh, not behind me, not ahead, but everywhere, all around me. And in that sound, I felt awareness, not human awareness, something patient, observing, lingering that I whispered again, trying to ground myself. Is anyone here? You don't have to be scared. My voice sounded tinny, weak, swallowed by the fog and darkness. Silence answered, thick and suffocating. I tried to move toward the stairs again, toward the exit, but every step felt as though the house itself resisted me, slowing, bending, hiding the path. And then I saw it, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, a shadow impossible to define, standing in the doorway of the room I had just passed. It wasn't moving, but I knew it was aware of me. I froze, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. I called out again, voice quivering. I just want to leave. I'm leaving. Nothing. Not even the softest reply. No scuffle, no movement. Just the oppressive awareness. Curling closer, filling the room, reaching into my chest. My pulse was hammering. Sweat prickled my neck. I wanted to run, but the fog on the floor seemed to cling to me, slowing me, holding me back. That I realized then that this wasn't a place meant to be found. Or maybe it was meant to be found by the wrong kind of attention. Whatever lingered here didn't want to be discovered. It wanted to observe, patient, waiting. And now that I had entered, it had me. I could feel it everywhere, in every corner, in the distortions of the walls, in the faint creaks and sighs. Watching that I moved back toward the staircase slowly, keeping my eyes on every shadow, scanning each room as I passed. Nothing followed visibly, nothing attacked, nothing spoke, but the sense of being observed never left. Every step felt weighted, every breath carried tension, every heartbeat was loud, almost deafening in the quiet house. I kept thinking I should turn and leave, drive away, forget this place, but I couldn't. Some part of me needed to know it wasn't just in my head, needed to confirm the presence was real. Finally, I made it to the front door. I reached for the handle, feeling the chill in the metal, the fog curling around my boots. My hand trembled. I told myself to step outside, to feel the real air, the safe air, to escape. And yet, as I pushed open the door, the darkness inside seemed to shift, coil slightly, like a living thing, pulling at my attention, trying to make me turn back. I forced myself forward, stepping into night air, fog curling and twisting around me as if disappointed to lose its visitor. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the awareness still, stretching from the house to the alley, into the empty streets, curling into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. I got back to my patrol car, heart still racing, palm slick, and drove off slowly, even as the house faded behind me. The feeling didn't leave. Something had been there. Something had watched me. And I knew, with a sinking certainty, that it would wait, that it would always wait. Some nights, I dream about it. Shadows in corners, whispers I can't place, and that suffocating feeling of eyes following, always following. I've walked many streets since, patrolled countless alleys, but I've never forgotten the empty house on Hawthorne Street. Empty? Maybe. Silent? Definitely not. And the awareness it left inside me, that never went away. I'd been on patrol for a few hours. The streets quiet, the fog rolling low across the asphalt like a living thing. The night had been uneventful until my walkie-talkie crackled. Soft static at first, the usual background noise of night shift, but then it changed. A voice slipped through, low, whispering, almost melodic, and distinctly not human. At first, I thought it was another officer calling from somewhere out of range. I reached for the radio. Unit 4, come in. Is anyone there? Only static answered. The whisper came again, faint, indistinct, curling into my ears. I swear it said something. A string of syllables that sounded like words, but not in any language I recognized. It sent a chill crawling up my spine. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Walkie-talkies sometimes pick up signals from other channels, other frequencies. Maybe a scanner, a prank. I tried switching channels, tuning in and out, but the whispers followed me, sliding through the static, sometimes overlapping, sometimes just at the edge, as if testing me, measuring me. The fog outside thickened, curling around lampposts, bending the streetlights into halos. My headlights cut a narrow path through it, but I could feel the shadows pressing just beyond the beam. I started walking slowly, boots crunching on wet pavement, heart thumping. The whispers continued, curling into my ears, sometimes faint, sometimes closer, almost like breath brushing my neck. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, sleep deprivation, months of night shifts, long stretches of quiet streets. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The voice was aware of me, intentional. It paused when I paused, speaking again when I moved, as if keeping pace, testing my reactions. Unit 4, I muttered under my breath, gripping the radio tighter. The whispers crescendoed for a moment, overlapping syllables, unintelligible, then disappeared, leaving the static ringing in my ears. I felt the air grow colder, the fog curling closer, and a deep unease settled in my chest. Something wasn't just following me. Something was interested in me. I started walking toward the end of the block, flashlight cutting the fog in narrow beams. Every step I took, I could feel the whispers behind me, always one step away, always just out of comprehension. My chest tightened, breathing shallow, pulse hammering. It wasn't a voice. It was more like a presence, using sound to reach me, probe me, make me aware that I was alone, but not alone. I stopped, radio in hand, listening. The whisper came again, clearer this time, curling into my ear. Here, or maybe it said watch. I couldn't be sure. But the moment I turned my head, the street was empty, nothing but fog, empty asphalt, and the weak glow of streetlights. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if whatever was at eyes everywhere. Even though I couldn't see them, I started walking again, trying to shake the fear, telling myself it couldn't hurt me. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a way that made my head spin. Sometimes I thought I heard my own name, just faintly carrying the static, just at the edge of comprehension. I spun around, shining my flashlight into every corner, every shadow. Nothing, but I knew it had been there, knew it had been calling me. Every rational thought began to dissolve. Months of night shifts, thousands of empty streets. Nothing had ever felt like this. The fog, the shadows, the radio, all of it had become alive, bending, reaching, whispering. My hands trembled. I clutched the radio tightly, wishing it would go silent, wishing I could turn it off, wishing I could believe it was over. And then it spoke my name, clear, deliberate, curling around my mind, not through the radio, not with words I could catch, but somehow inside me. I stumbled back, heart racing, a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck. My flashlight wavered in my hands. The fog shifted as if acknowledging me, stretching and bending. I realized I wasn't just being followed. I was being targeted. I tried to move, forced myself to take step after step down the street, but the whispers changed tone, mocking, patient, probing. It wasn't a voice, it was attention, focusing entirely on me. And I couldn't escape it. Not by running, not by hiding. The city itself seemed to bend, twist, funneling my path into the fog, into the whispers, into the invisible presence that had chosen me. I remember the industrial lot, the empty house, the impossible shadows. This felt connected. All the previous nights, all the strange incidents. It had been building, waiting, preparing. And now, through this radio, through these whispers, it was making itself known. I could feel my sanity fraying at the edges, every rational thought overpowered by the creeping certainty that I was being hunted, Not physically, but mentally, spiritually, in some way I couldn't explain. I gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to keep my focus, trying to push the fear down. I told myself to breathe, to ground myself. The whispers grew louder, a chorus now, overlapping, impossible to distinguish, yet all of it centered on me. My pulse throbbed in my temples, ears ringing from the intensity. I stumbled, almost falling to my knees, the fog curling around me, thick and suffocating. Then, suddenly, silence. The radio went dead, nothing but static. My heartbeat was loud, echoing in my chest. The fog lingered, curling around the streetlights like smoke, but the whispers had vanished. I shook my head, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had moved on. Maybe it was just a trick. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the radio. I tried to convince myself to move forward, to patrol the rest of the block, but every step felt heavier, weighted by the memory of the voices. The awareness didn't leave, even in the absence of sound. I could feel it behind me, in the corners of my mind, in the spaces between the fog, in the subtle movements of shadows. Always watching, always waiting. Patient, endless. I started walking again, slow, deliberate, trying to shake the paranoia, trying to remember the rules of the streets, of reality. But the radio crackled again. Soft static at first, then the whispers returned. Not clear words this time, just a sound of intent, focus and deliberate, curling around my mind. My pulse skyrocketed. I pressed the radio to my chest, wishing it would stop, wishing I could run. But I couldn't. The whispers weren't just voices. They were awareness, attention, focused entirely on me. I realized then that I wasn't just patrolling the streets. I was being led by the whispers, by the presence, by something patient and unseen, bending the world subtly to guide me, to hold me, to mark me. Every shadow seemed alive. Every corner stretched unnaturally. Every fog was tugged at the edges of my vision. I couldn't tell where the city ended and the presence began. I was trapped in its awareness, alone and utterly exposed. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time lost meaning. I moved without thinking, driven by the dual desire to escape and to understand. The radio whispered intermittently. Sometimes my name, sometimes strings of unintelligible sounds that felt like threats, like promises. The fog thickened, swallowing lampposts and alleys, curling around my legs, reaching toward me as if disappointed I had not yet faltered. I finally reached an intersection I recognized, a rare point of clarity in the fog. The whispers receded slightly, but I knew they hadn't left. The presence lingered in the spaces around me, in the folds of shadow, in the subtle distortions of the streetlights. I felt marked, targeted, chosen, and I realized with a deep, sinking dread that leaving the area wouldn't free me. Not really. Not ever. Even now, weeks later, I can hear faint whispers in the static of radios, in the hum of distant electricity, in the subtle rustle of leaves in the wind. They linger, patient and waiting, and I know, somewhere, they're still focused on me, measuring, marking, stretching awareness across the empty streets, across the fog, across the world. Always aware, always patient, always waiting. It started with the radio dying completely. 1 second. The static-filled whispers were there, curling in and out of comprehension, and the next, nothing. Dead silence, as if the world itself had cut off the signal. I tapped the walkie-talkie, flipped through channels, pressed buttons, tried to reset it. Nothing. Only the faint hum of the battery, mocking me. I reached for my phone. The screen flickered, then went black. Not a dead battery. I had charged it fully before the shift, but the screen refused to light. I pressed it again, harder, almost slamming it against my palm. Nothing. The lights inside the screen remained dark, like it had ceased to exist. My stomach twisted. 2 lines of communication gone. No backup, no contact, no reassurance. Just me, the night, and the fog. I told myself to breathe. Rational thought. I could handle this. Phones fail. Radios fail. Equipment breaks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't malfunctioning. Something had taken them, or maybe something had cut them off from the world. Something that wanted me isolated, alone, vulnerable. My pulse raced. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get to my car, to flee the empty streets. But I felt rooted in place. The fog had thickened. Not just a usual low-lying mist, but dense, curling, coiling around the streetlights, stretching down alleys and across sidewalks. The beams of my flashlight barely penetrated it, and every corner looked alive. Shadows stretched, contracted, bending the edges of perception. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I could feel something moving just beyond vision, adjusting, waiting, like the fog itself was aware of me. I stepped forward, careful, boots crunching on wet asphalt. The night air was heavy, almost suffocating, carrying faint echoes of whispers I couldn't place. The street was empty, or seemed empty, but every sense told me otherwise. Movement at the edge of vision, just a subtle distortion, a curl in fog, a brush of sound that didn't belong. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, the pressure, fatigue, but the feeling pressed harder, making every step feel wrong, unnatural. Then my flashlight flickered, a brief, violent stutter of light, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before the beam returned. And when it did, I swear, just for a moment, the shadows moved differently. Not like shadows, not like figures, but like shapes stretching at impossible angles. My breath caught. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. I should have run. I should have driven off, called someone, anything, but my feet wouldn't move. The fog was thick around my ankles, heavy, dragging at me, pulling me deeper into the street. A soft, metallic clink echoed somewhere to my right. I swung the flashlight, catching a glint of something on the pavement, small, reflective, nothing I could identify. My mind raced. A drop tool? Trash? Or someone or something watching, leaving subtle marks to make sure I knew it was aware. The thought made my stomach churn. I gripped the flashlight tighter, knuckles white, and moved cautiously toward the sound. The second I stepped forward, the radio crackled again, not with static, not with voices, but a single word. Here. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made the hair on my neck stand on end. I spun in place, scanning the fog, the streets, the alleys, but there was nothing. No one, no figure, just fog curling like smoke, twisting into impossible shapes. And yet, I knew the word had been directed at me. Focused, intentional. I swallowed, trying to calm myself. This is a malfunction, I muttered under my breath, though the lie rang hollow. Nothing malfunctioned like this. Nothing behaved this way. The night had shifted, twisted into a realm that wasn't supposed to exist, and it had my full attention. I kept moving, each step careful, deliberate, but the fog seemed to push back. It shifted with me, curling around my legs, rising, lowering, masking edges of the street. I could feel its weight, pressing against my chest, slow in my heart, pulling my focus inward. And then the whispers returned, not from the radio this time, but inside my head, curling around my thoughts. Faint at first, just teasing, almost melodic, then rising, layering over each other, unintelligible yet deliberate. My legs trembled. I stopped. I tried to speak into the night, into the fog. Who's there? Show yourself. My voice echoed unnaturally, swallowed immediately, leaving a ringing emptiness that pressed against my ears. The whispering paused, leaving only silence. Then a single syllable, long and drawn, curling through the air and into my mind. You. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a raised section of asphalt. The fog swirled around me, curling like fingers, brushing my arms, wrapping around my boots. The streetlights flickered violently, one after another, plunging me into sudden darkness before returning with weak, stuttering illumination. I felt like the city itself had become a cage, every corner a barrier, every shadow a watcher, every curl amidst a hand trying to guide me where it wanted. I tried to call dispatch on the dead radio, hitting buttons frantically, but nothing happened. Every attempt made the fog seem denser, thicker, as if it fed on my panic. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief blackness, I felt it closer, an awareness patient pressing against my chest, curling around my senses. I could feel it examining me, stretching through the night, measuring my fear, marking me. Then faintly footsteps. Not my own, not far ahead, not behind. Somewhere between reality and impossible perception. Slow, deliberate, matching my pace almost exactly. I froze, heart hammering, sweat prickling at the back of my neck. My flashlight cut wildly across the fog, trying to catch a glimpse, anything, but the street was empty. Every step echoed unnaturally in the stillness, yet nothing emerged. The footsteps continued, patient, echoing in my mind as much as the street. I told myself to run, but my body betrayed me. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my legs moved forward, as though something unseen had taken hold, guiding me down the street, deeper into the fog. The whispers returned, layered and overlapping, curling around my thoughts, filling my mind with incomprehensible murmurs. I tried to focus, tried to block them, tried to ground myself in reality, but it was impossible. A soft clatter echoed behind me, a single metallic sound. I spun, beam of the flashlight slicing through thick fog, and for a heartbeat I saw something. A shadow, impossibly thin, stretching vertically, bending at angles no human could bend. It recoiled instantly, curling into the darkness, leaving only the empty street. My heart raced, mind screaming, but I couldn't convince myself I'd imagined it. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it had noticed me. I moved again, careful, slow, each step a negotiation between fear and survival. The fog pressed closer, curling around my legs, rising to obscure the street, hiding edges, shifting perspective. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every sound, every movement, every flicker of light made me jump. The whispers teased me constantly, the syllables curling inside my head, focusing on me, aware of my every thought. Finally, I reached a corner I recognized, a familiar point in the patrol route. The fog began to thin. The radio remained dead, the phone dark. Yet I could feel the presence lingering, stretching outward, patient, endless, waiting. I could hear faint whispers inside my mind, gentle but insistent, telling me I was not yet free, not yet done, still a part of the night it had claimed. I collapsed into my patrol car eventually, gripping the wheel, chest heaving. The fog drifted slowly past the windshield, curling over the asphalt, bending light and shadow, as if disappointed I had survived. The whispers had gone silent for now, but the awareness remained, pressing against me like a weight in the chest, a mark I couldn't wash away. Even now, in daylight, when the city seems ordinary, I can feel the residue of that night. The thick fog, the static, the whispers curling at the edges of perception. I know it didn't end. I wasn't meant to escape completely. The night, the static, the awareness, they are patient, and they will wait. Always. It started like any other night. Quiet streets and the usual fog curling low across the asphalt. But something had shifted. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of the car. A weight pressing on the edges of my senses. A subtle tension that made my skin crawl. The walkie-talkie had been silent. The radio dead. My phone dark. I should have turned back. I should have driven away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I walked down the street slowly, flashlight cutting narrow beams through the mist. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the fog itself resisted me, curling around my boots, clinging to my legs. The shadows between the streetlights stretched unnaturally, bending in ways my mind knew weren't possible. Still, I pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination, the strain of the night, the isolation. But deep down, I knew better. Something was here, aware of me, patient, waiting. I reached the intersection at the end of the block, the fog thickening into a wall that obscured everything beyond. I squinted into the haze, trying to see past it, trying to ground myself. That's when I noticed it. The air itself seemed to shimmer, a subtle distortion, like heat rising off asphalt in summer. But wrong. Colder, denser. And within that shimmer, I felt it. Awareness. Not human. Not alive in any normal sense, but aware. I called out, voice echoing unnaturally, swallowed almost immediately by the fog. Hello? Is anyone there? My words vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence and that weight pressing against my chest. And then I heard it, the softest, faintest whisper curling around my ears. Not through the radio this time. Not coming from anywhere. Inside me. Here, it said. I froze. My pulse spiked. My flashlight trembled in my hands. I took a step backward. And then another. The fog swirled around me, curling like smoke, shifting with my movements as it were alive, aware, shaping itself around my presence. I turned to leave, but the street seemed to stretch, elongate impossibly. Every familiar landmark shifted subtly, edges blurred, the street lights bending and flickering. I was disoriented, but I knew one thing. I wasn't supposed to leave. Another whisper, faint and distant. My name. I didn't recognize it at first. I've heard my name countless times over radios, reports, calls. But this was different, drawn out, deliberate, curling inside my mind like fingers tracing my skull. I spun in place, searching the fog, my flashlight slicing through shadows. Nothing, not a single figure, just the fog, just the silence. But it knew me. It had been following, waiting. I stumbled forward, trying to find something familiar, some anchor, but every step felt wrong. Pavement stretched unnaturally beneath my boots, shadows bending into impossible angles. The fog thickened, curling around my chest, pressing against my lungs. I tried to shake it off, to ground myself, and that's when I saw a movement, not in the fog directly, but within it, a ripple, subtle and fluid, like a figure bending at the edge of perception. I blinked. It vanished. Panic surged. My legs trembled, my breathing shallow, chest tight. I tried to call for help, my voice cracking, but no sound emerged. Not through the radio, not through the phone, not even my own throat. Only my heartbeat pounding in my ears, deafening in the fog. And then, just for a second, I felt it brush past me. Awareness, patient, deliberate, lingering at my back. Watching, waiting. I spun around. Nothing. Just fog, just the empty street, twisting impossibly. I started moving faster, boots splashing through puddles, flashlight beam swinging wildly, trying to find in a block the curve of a street I recognized, anything. But the fog bent, edges shifting, landmarks disappearing, replaced by impossible angles and twisted shadows. My pulse surged. Every instinct screamed to run, but my body felt foreign, sluggish, trapped. A low hum rose, barely audible at first, then louder, curling into my ears, vibrating through the bones of my skull. I froze. The fog around me thickened into a solid wall of white, blinding, suffocating. My flashlight flickered violently, then died completely. Darkness pressed from every side. I could feel the awareness, patient, deliberate, curling around me, pressing inside my chest, inside my skull, as if measuring my fear, marking me. I tried to turn, to retrace my steps, but the fog stretched endlessly in every direction. The street I walked only moments ago was gone, replaced by a blank white void. My breaths came in short, harsh gasps. The hum rose into a high-pitched screech, then faded into a low whisper, insistent, overlapping, unintelligible, yet directed entirely at me. My mind spun. Time felt meaningless. Space had vanished. I was entirely alone, but not alone. Then, something moved in the distance. Not a figure, not a shadow, but a distortion, a ripple in the fog, bending light and perception. It drew closer, slow, deliberate, shifting toward me in impossible ways. I backed away, heart hammering, flashlight useless, breath shallow. The fog wrapped around me, curling, thickening, pressing closer. And then it stopped. Silence. Absolute. Empty, except for the awareness. I could feel it waiting, patient, measuring. And in that silence, I realized I couldn't move forward. I couldn't move back. I wasn't trapped physically, there was space. But the world itself had changed. The fog, the street, the landmarks I had known, the very perception of reality, they had been around me. I was at a point where the city and whatever had chosen me overlapped. where the familiar and impossible collided. A vanishing point. I tried calling again, voice raw, cracking. Nothing. My radio remained dead, my phone black. My own words echoed faintly in my mind before fading. The fog swirled, curling closer, brushing my arms, coiling around my legs, pressing against my chest. The awareness lingered just beyond perception, patient, deliberate. I realized with a shudder that it didn't want me to panic. It didn't want me to flee. It wanted me to notice, to be aware, to know I had been seen. I took another step, then another, try and force a path forward, but the fog stretched endlessly. Each footstep felt like it carried me deeper into a world I didn't understand. I could feel the presence, patient, deliberate, moving with me yet remaining just out of reach, shaping the reality around me, bending space subtly and possibly. My pulse hammered, breath shallow, mind screaming for comprehension, for logic, for escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog thinned slightly. Streetlights flickered in the distance. A curve of pavement I recognized appeared faintly ahead. Relief surged, but it was hollow. The awareness remained, lingering, pressing, patient, everywhere and nowhere. I realized that even if I made out physically, a part of me would remain behind. A mark had been left, a claim. I took careful steps toward the faint light, never letting my senses relax, aware that the moment I stopped or looked away, it could return. But even as I reached what looked like the familiar intersection, the feeling didn't leave. It pressed lightly, subtly like a reminder, a whisper without sound. Something had chosen me, observed me, and whatever it was, it didn't belong to the world I had known. I climbed back into my patrol car, body trembling, hands slick with sweat. The fog lingered just beyond the windshield, curling lazily across the pavement. The streets looked empty, ordinary again, but I knew better. The awareness remained patient, deliberate, always waiting. And as I drove slowly back to the station, every instinct screaming, I realized the vanishing point wasn't just a place. It was a moment, a threshold, a subtle breach in reality, and I had stepped through it. Even now, in daylight, when the city seems ordinary, I can feel it. Not in my eyes, not in my ears, but deep in my chest, curling around my thoughts. Patient, waiting, watching. The fog, the whispers, the impossible awareness. It's still there, always. And I know, if I return tonight, it will be waiting just beyond sight, just at the edge of perception, ready to pull me back into the vanishing point. The night shift had a rhythm, endless hum of fluorescent lights, the distant thrum of traffic on the highway, and the occasional crunch of tires over gravel. I had been doing this for months, guarding a storage facility on the outskirts of town, where the streets were mostly empty after 10. The work was monotonous, almost meditative, until the night I noticed something that made all my routines collapse. I was sitting in a little booth by the main gate, the monitor screen flickering softly, the glow illuminating my face. Coffee in one hand, a walkie-talkie in the other, scanning the parking lot out the window. That's when I saw it. A car, not far from the entrance, headlights off, idling, or moving. It didn't make sense at first. There was no driver. I leaned closer, squinting through the glass, but the shadows hid the interior. The car rolled slowly, smoothly, as if guided by an unseen hand. My pulse spiked. I grabbed the walkie-talkie. Dispatch? Do we have any vehicles moving on the lot? Silence. Only the low hum of the monitors. I tried again. Nothing. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. Maybe someone had left it in neutral. Maybe the hill made it roll. But the lot was perfectly flat. This shouldn't be happening. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, thick, and smelled faintly of wet asphalt. Fog was starting to curl around the edges of the lot, curling across the pavement like smoke. The car rolled closer, moving in slow arcs, obeying some invisible pattern I couldn't comprehend. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the concrete. I circled the vehicle cautiously. Still no one inside. The windows were dark, reflective, but empty. My flashlight caught the rims, the hood, the body, No fingerprints, no disturbance, no indication of anyone being there. And yet the car kept moving, as if it had awareness, as if it were alive. I took a step back, bumping into a pole, and the car adjusted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but it followed, mirroring my movements. Heart hammering, I retreated toward the booth. My radio crackled faintly, static whispering, but no voices, no explanations. The car's movements grew bolder, rolling in circles now, precise, deliberate, and every shift felt directed at me. I tried to call the main office again, voice trembling. We have a situation here. Vehicle moving on its own. My words sounded absurd even as I spoke them. There was no reply. The lot was silent, empty, except for the car and the fog curling around it. I forced myself to approach it again, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. Each step made my boots crunch against the gravel. I swept the beam across the interior, hoping, needing, to see a driver, a figure, anything human. Nothing. The steering wheel didn't turn. The tires followed the curves of the lot naturally, smoothly, without explanation. My mind raced, searching for logic, but logic fled. This shouldn't be possible. And yet I saw it. I felt it. A low wind whispered across the lot, carrying the faint scent of oil and damp concrete. My skin prickled. The car stopped abruptly, perfectly centered between two parking spaces. I froze, chest tight, flashlight trembling in my hands. And then the headlights flickered on, bright, blinding, and for a second I thought I saw movement, something leaning against the back seat. I blinked and the light went off. Nothing. Empty. Silent. The fog swirled lazily as if mocking me. I stepped back, trembling, trying to gather my thoughts. Was this a prank? No one had access. Could it be a technical malfunction? But I had inspected this lot countless times. Every vehicle, every system, every gate was secure. Nothing accounted for this. The car began to move again, slowly, deliberately, tracing a path that made no sense. And with every movement, I felt it watching me, not just aware of me, but focused on me. I called the office again, voice higher now, cracking. I need backup. Vehicle, it's moving on its own. I don't. My words died in the static. No response. The monitors flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw shadows shifting across the screens, shapes that didn't belong. My pulse thundered in my ears. The car circled the lot now, tracing patterns that were deliberate, almost intelligent. Each turn, each pause, seemed designed to keep me unsettled, to draw my attention, to make me aware of its presence. I felt it then, not through sight, but through instinct. A prickling sensation along my spine, hair standing on end, a cold weight pressing at the base of my skull. Awareness. Not human, not mechanical. Conscious. I stumbled back toward the booth, desperate to reach safety. But even then, the car adjusted. It moved as if sensing me, anticipating, aware. I could no longer convince myself it was a coincidence or a technical error. It was watching. I gripped the edge of the booth, breath heaving, flashlight beam swinging wildly across the lot. The fog thickened, curling like smoke, masking details, hiding edges, stretching perception. And then the car stopped again, perfectly still, headlights off, no engine sound, nothing, only the fog, curling, shifting, alive with tension. I dared to breathe, carefully, slowly, trying to convince myself it had paused, waiting, not aware, not alive, but I could feel it, focused, patient, watching. I stepped forward, hand trembling as I reached for the door handle, heart hammering. The car moved, smoothly, silently, a single, deliberate shift closer. My mind screamed, but my body froze. I could feel the tension like a weight, pressing against my chest, curling around my senses, and I realized with a sinking certainty, I had been drawn here, alone, exposed, vulnerable. I turned sharply, scanning the lot, searching for an explanation, a trick, a human hand somewhere. Nothing. Empty spaces, silent monitors, fog curling, the world itself holding its breath, and the car just beyond the beam of my flashlight, waiting, moving subtly and possibly perfectly aware. I backed up toward the booth, trying to keep my eyes on it, trying to keep my mind focused. But every rational thought fled. I knew this was something beyond comprehension, beyond reason. Then, just for a moment, the headlights flicked on again. I thought I saw a figure, just a shadow, leaning against the passenger side. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished. My pulse raced, sweat dripping down my neck, chills crawling along my arms. The fog twisted around the lot, curling and stretching, as if responding, mocking, aware of my terror. I stumbled into the booth, bolting the door behind me, breathing ragged, flashlight trembling. I kept watching, every sense screaming, waiting for the next movement. The car shifted slightly, circling the lot again, slowly, deliberately, tracing invisible patterns. I could feel its awareness, patient, deliberate, intelligent. I tried to rationalize, try to breathe, try to tell myself it was nothing, but I knew it wasn't nothing. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning. I stayed in the booth, flashlight fixed on the lot, eyes straining through the fog. The car continued its movements, subtle, deliberate, intelligent. Every time I thought I had a moment to breathe, it adjusted, changed direction, traced a new path. Awareness, focus, patience. The word echoed in my mind like a drumbeat. Aware. By the end of the night, the car vanished. Headlights gone, engine silent, no trace. I checked the lot, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. But I knew it hadn't left. The awareness remained, lingering in the air, curling in the fog, pressing against my chest. It wasn't bound to metal. It wasn't bound to wheels. It existed in the space, in the observation, in the unseen. Waiting. Patient. Even now, I can feel it. Not in sight, not in sound, but in perception, in instinct, curling around the edges of my awareness. I don't know if it will return, or if it has followed me since that night. But the lot, the fog, the empty streets, they are never the same, because something watches, moves, waits, and I know without question that it is aware of me. The next night felt like it should have been routine, but the unease from the night before clung to me, sticky and suffocating. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, just nerves, the fog, and the endless silence of the lot. But every instinct in my body told me to stay alert, to never let my eyes wander from the monitors. I hadn't slept well, and the coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't risk taking my attention off the screens. Not again. I flipped through the security footage from the previous night, trying to rationalize, to make sense of what I had seen. That car, moving on its own, no driver, as if it had a mind. I rewound, paused, zoomed in, and that's when I noticed something else. Faces, reflected in the windows. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Faces staring out, always fleeting, always impossible. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe my mind was filling in blanks. But the faces were too distinct, too deliberate, pale, shadowed, with eyes that seemed aware of me watching them. And the cars themselves, none of them existed in reality. At least, none of the cars that should have been on the lot. I checked the log. No deliveries, no movements, no drivers. Nothing. Yet there they were. I leaned closer to the monitor, heart hammering. Each frame revealed subtle differences, slight changes in expression, as if the faces were aware of me now, aware that I was watching. A man with hollow eyes, a woman whose lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes, children staring silently, unmoving. They weren't trying to communicate, not directly, but the awareness, the presence, it was tangible, pressing against the edges of perception. The footage looped, static flickering occasionally, like the cameras themselves were reacting. Shadows shifted unnaturally, bending around the faces. Some were partially obscured, as if emerging from another plane, another reality, yet fully visible in the glass. My pulse raced, hands clammy, mind scrambling for an explanation. Ghosts? Hallucinations? Technical error? None of it made sense, and that was the worst part. I knew, deep down, this wasn't a glitch. I reached for the walkie-talkie, voice tight. Dispatch? Did anyone see any unauthorized vehicles on the lot last night? Only static. I press harder, hoping, needing for a reply. Nothing. My hands trembled. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the monitors, trying to ground myself. The lot outside was empty, silent, normal, or as normal as it ever felt at this hour. But the footage, the faces, they were real, somehow real. I took a sip of cold coffee, trying to steady my nerves. But as I did, the shadows on the screen shifted again. Faces appeared in new cars, ones that had never been there before. Each face blinked slowly, deliberately. They were patient, waiting, not for me to notice them, but for me to acknowledge them, to recognize their presence. My stomach churned. I couldn't look away, yet I wanted to scream, to tear my eyes from the monitors. A chill crawled up my spine. I leaned closer, zooming in on one of the faces. A young man, his eyes hollow and black, staring straight at the camera as if seeing through it. I could feel him looking at me. And then, impossibly, the shadow of a smile appeared, slow, deliberate, curling in a way that made my chest tighten. I swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. My mind screamed that I was seeing something impossible, something wrong. But my eyes refused to leave the screen. The static in the feed shifted suddenly, a low hiss that sounded almost like breathing. I froze, straining to listen. The room was silent, except for the hum of the monitors and the faint creak of the booth settling. The faces on the screen seemed to multiply, emerging in corners of cars that shouldn't exist, in vehicles that weren't even on the lot. They were everywhere now, filling empty spaces, peering through glass, always watching. I pressed pause, thinking I could stop it, freeze it in place. But the faces continued to change subtly, even in the frozen frame. A slight tilt of the head, a slow blink, eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. My pulse hammered, heart threatening to burst from my chest. Every rational thought fled, replaced by a raw, undeniable terror. I wasn't just watching footage. I was being watched. I turned to glance at the lot outside, needing some grounding in reality. Empty, quiet, cold, yet the awareness didn't leave. It clung to me, pressing in the space between my ears, curling at the base of my skull, a subtle weight I couldn't shake. I spun back to the monitors. One of the faces had moved again, now in a car that had been empty before. Slowly, deliberately, it turned its head to face the camera directly, as if acknowledging me, knowing I was there. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the desk. Coffee spilled slightly onto my uniform, but I didn't care. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. Another face appeared in the background, pale and hollow-eyed, shifting slightly, leaning closer to the window glass. The cameras themselves seemed to pulse, flicker, adjusting focus as it tried to reveal more, to show me. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I wasn't just observing anymore. I was being drawn in. A low static hiss rose from the monitors, like a whisper curling just at the edge of hearing. I pressed the volume buttons, trying to drown it out, but it grew louder, layered, overlapping, as if multiple voices were murmuring in tandem. I couldn't make out words, only a tone of awareness, patience, intent. I felt exposed, my body tightening with fear, the room closing in, every shadow lengthening, stretching toward me. I backed away from the desk, heart racing, flashlight forgotten, monitors glowing faintly in the dim booth. The faces didn't vanish. They multiplied, emerging in every corner of every frame, filling spaces that shouldn't exist. Hollow eyes followed me, shifting slightly, turning toward wherever I moved. My pulse surged, nausea curling in my stomach. I had no explanation, no rational way to account for what I was seeing. Only fear, patient and deliberate. I tried to shake my head, close the laptop, shut off the monitors, but the faces remained, reflected in the screens and the darkened glass of my booth windows, even in the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I could feel them there, aware, focused, patient, lingering. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave, to abandon the lot entirely. But my body felt heavy, sluggish, trapped by some invisible force. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time lost meaning. I stayed in the booth, paralyzed by the screens, the monitors, the awareness curling in the edges of my perception. Every time I thought I could tear my eyes away, a new face emerged. A child, a man, a woman, always hollow-eyed, patient, waiting, not threatening, not immediately violent, but present, always watching, always aware, always patient. I realized then that it didn't matter what I did. I could leave the lot, I could call someone, I could abandon the monitors entirely. But the awareness remained. The faces weren't bound to cameras or cars or windows. They existed in the edges of perception, in the space between reality and impossibility. And I had seen them. That acknowledgement alone was enough. By the end of the night, when dawn crept faintly across the lot, the footage looked ordinary. Cars, empty spaces, monitors glowing softly. No faces, no anomalies. I checked the logs again, triple-checked the timestamps, the cameras, the angles, nothing, just routine. And yet I knew the truth. I had seen what couldn't exist, and I had known I was watching. Even now, long after that shift, I can feel it. A weight at the edge of perception, subtle, patient, lingering. Faces that might appear in shadows, reflections, or on screens when no one is watching. Hollow eyes that remember, that wait, that observe. And I know without doubt that one day they will notice me again. And when they do, I won't be able to look away. I thought leaving the lot would bring relief. I thought driving home would wash off the tension, the eyes in the windows, the movements that had no explanation. But the moment I started my car, I realized that nothing about that night was over. The lot receded behind me like a half-remembered dream. But the feeling, the pressure, the awareness clung to me, sticky and insistent. The drive was quiet, unnervingly quiet. No other cars on the road, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see shapes lurking in the fog, reflections of faces that had no business existing. But there was nothing, only my reflection, pale and tense, eyes wide. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I had left it behind at the lot, trapped in the empty spaces, confined to monitors and cars in the fog that had swallowed the streets. Rationally, I knew that made no sense. None of it did. And yet every instinct in my body screamed that something had followed me, had learned my route, had traced my movements with patient, deliberate attention. I turned onto the familiar side street that led to my apartment complex. The streetlights flickered, one by one, leaving pools of darkness between weak glows. I slowed, scanning every shadow, every darkened window. Nothing moved, nothing emerged, yet I felt it, the presence subtle and patient, curling at the edges of perception, pressing lightly against my chest, as if measuring, testing, waiting. I swallowed hard, voice catching when I muttered, "It's not real. It can't be real." The closer I got to home, the thicker the feeling became. Not heavy like fear alone. No, this was different. Patient, intentional. It wasn't trying to hurt me. Not yet, but it was aware of me, tracking me, following. I could feel it in every subtle shift in the air, every flicker of light, every reflection in my mirrors. Awareness that didn't belong. Not natural, not human. I parked in the lot outside my building, trying to steady my breathing. The apartment lights glowed faintly, comforting, mundane. Yet as I reached the door, I felt it, a weight in the air, shifting. Awareness curling at the edges of my perception, just beyond sight. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it, trying to convince myself I was imagining the lingering tension from the night shift. But I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Still, ordinary. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of a clock. I dropped my keys on the counter and rubbed my eyes, trying to scrub away the residue of the lot, of the monitors, of the impossibility. Coffee sat cold in the mug I had brought with me, untouched. I drained it anyway, hoping the bitter warmth would ground me. It didn't. I flicked on the lights, trying to erase shadows, to reclaim the mundane. Yet the feeling didn't leave. not from the corners of the ceiling, not from the spaces between the furniture, not from the faint reflections in the windows. I could feel it lingering, patient, deliberate, waiting. It didn't need to move. Its presence was enough. The same awareness I felt on the lot now permeated my home, turning familiar spaces alien, bending perception subtly, impossibly. I tried to distract myself, to work, to focus on mundane things, checking messages, scanning emails, listening to music. But every note, every sound, every movement felt distorted, as if the world itself was under scrutiny. The blinds, which I closed hours before, shifted slightly. I swore I saw shadows press against the glass. A face? Maybe just a trick of light. But I froze, breath caught in my throat. The awareness pressed in, patient and deliberate, and I couldn't ignore it. The phone on the counter rang. I jumped, heart hammering. Picked it up, expecting a colleague to dispatch anyone, but the line was silent. Only static, faintly whispering, curling around my ears. I wanted to hang up, throw the phone across the room, but I couldn't. My thumb hovered, paralyzed by the sense that moving might provoke something, might draw attention. I stayed frozen, listening. The static whispered like voices I couldn't understand, layered, patient, deliberate. I moved to the window, gripping the sill, trying to convince myself I was seeing reflections of streetlights, the glare of passing cars. But then I noticed a shadow in the parking lot below. No movement, no figure, yet a distortion. Something there, watching, waiting. I stepped back, pressing myself against the wall, heart hammering, trying to remind myself I was inside, safe, ordinary. But the awareness pressed against me even here, patient, deliberate, as if it had followed me from the lot. Sleep became impossible. Every creak, every distant noise made my chest tighten, pulse racing. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, exhaustion, the residue of fear, but the feeling of being watched didn't relent. Shadows seemed to shift with intention, corners of rooms darkening impossibly, reflections lingering just a fraction too long. Awareness that didn't belong in the real world had followed me into mine, curling, persistent, impossible. I tried leaving again, stepping out to the balcony, scanning the street below. Empty. Nothing. Yet I could feel it pressing at the edges of perception, patient, deliberate, marking me. The night was quiet, the fog absent, the city ordinary, and yet the awareness remained persistent and patient, coiled in the corners of my vision, pressing lightly against my chest, reminding me that I had been followed, that the entity had learned, adapted, tracked. I started keeping lights on, checking every monitor, every reflection, try to reclaim control. But no measure could erase the sense of attention. The entity didn't need form. It didn't need movement. Its awareness alone was enough, patient and deliberate, curling in my chest, pressing against my skull, persistent as the hum of the city outside. Even in the mundane, it remained, watching, waiting. By dawn, I could barely recall how long I had been awake, but exhaustion didn't weaken the presence. It remained patient, lingering in the air, bending perception subtly, invisibly. The ordinary world was no longer safe, no longer familiar. Every reflection, every shadow, every glint of glass was a reminder, a hint, a whisper. The entity had followed, and I knew with certainty that it would not leave me alone. Not ever. Even now, as I sit at this desk, recounting it, I can feel at the edges of perception, awareness patient, deliberate, curling around me, pressing lightly against my chest. Not threatening, not violent, but impossible to ignore. Always present, always watching, waiting. The last round isn't over. It never ends. And I know deep down that this entity, whatever it is, will follow me for the rest of my life. Curling into corners, lingering in reflections, patient and deliberate, until I can't tell where it ends and I begin. The city at night has a rhythm, a pulse that hums beneath the streetlights, soft and constant, almost hypnotic if you let yourself notice it. On my first night patrolling these narrow alleys, I thought I would get used to it. I thought I would get used to the shadows, the distant hum of cars, the occasional drip of water from a fire escape. I was wrong. I started at the main street, flashlight in hand, uniform crisp but already stiff from hours in the booth. The alleyways were narrow, twisting, lined with old brick walls and dumpsters that smelled faintly of rot. The air had that damp, metallic tang you find in places where the sun never really reaches. My boots echoed softly on the cracked pavement, each step deliberate, keeping me aware, keeping me alert. It was quiet at first, too quiet, just the hum of the city, the occasional distant siren. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, curling around the brick walls, bouncing off the metal fire escapes. I froze, flashlight sweeping slowly over the alley. Nothing, just darkness, narrow shadows, empty spaces. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was the wind, the acoustics of the alley, bouncing faint echoes of distant voices. But it wasn't. It came again, a faint murmur, soft but deliberate. I couldn't make out words, only a tone of patience, of observation. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took another careful step forward, listening. The whisper shifted, moving with me, never loud, never direct, but persistent, curling around my senses. I shone the flashlight down the alley. Trash bins leaned awkwardly. The alleyways were always narrow, confining. And at night, they felt even tighter, as if the buildings leaned in just to watch me pass. That night, the fog rolled in unusually fast, thick and cold, curling around corners, slipping along the asphalt like liquid. The streetlights struggled to pierce it, painting pale halos that barely touched the ground. Each step I took seemed to echo longer than it should, swallowed by the mist, leaving me disoriented and tense. I gripped my flashlight tightly, letting the beam slice through the fog in short, deliberate sweeps. Shadows danced, elongating and shrinking unnaturally, twisting against walls and dumpsters. I reminded myself over and over that it was just a fog, just the lights, just my mind reacting to the isolation. But the alleyways felt wrong, silent in a way that pressed against the ears, as if the world had muted itself just for me. I paused at a corner, straining to see ahead. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. A shadow, pale and thin, flickered across the mist. It wasn't attached to any object, wasn't a reflection or a tree branch, just a shape sliding across the fog, obeying no logical path. My pulse spiked, a cold shiver running down my spine. I swung the flashlight toward it. Nothing, just mist curling, swaying, and the alleyway stretching into the darkness. I took another step, forcing myself forward. The mist thickened, curling higher, brushing my face and neck with damp fingers. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and insistent, curling around the edges of my perception. Not from a speaker, not from behind a wall, not human. It felt inside me, brushing against my thoughts. My stomach tightened. "Hello?" I called, voice breaking slightly. Silence answered, except for the hiss of fog curling around walls. Shadows shifted again. Not just one. I saw several now, moving in impossible ways, stretching vertically, bending around corners they shouldn't, wrapping around light poles, and vanishing as if dissolving into nothing. Each movement was deliberate in a way that made my chest tighten with awareness. They weren't random. They weren't tricks. They were aware. I stopped and took a slow, deep breath. Tried to rationalize. Maybe someone was playing with a light source, a prank, or I was just losing my mind from exhaustion. But the alleyways didn't offer an explanation. Every shadow I tried to focus on stretched and moved just out of comprehension. My eyes strained, mind spinning. Even my flashlight seemed weaker than usual, the beam flickering as if struggling against the mist itself. I rounded another corner and froze. Ahead, the alley bent sharply and the fog twisted, curling a way that almost formed a tunnel. Shapes flickered within it, human-like, but wrong. Limbs stretched, torsos elongated, heads tilting at impossible angles. My heart pounded, each beat thudding painfully in my ears. I wanted to turn back, wanted to flee, but my feet refused. They were glued to the pavement by some instinctual horror, the awareness that something was watching me. A whisper rose again, clearer this time. Not words, not sentences, just a low, curling tone that felt like it was slipping into my skull. My stomach churned. I spun the flashlight across the fog, but the shapes moved faster than my beam, always just at the edge of clarity. They weren't approaching me directly. They weren't retreating. They were circling, observing, deliberate in ways I couldn't comprehend. I forced myself to move forward, taking slow, careful steps. The alley seemed to stretch beneath me, longer than it should have been, corners that I remembered from countless patrols now bending in ways that defied geometry. Every familiar landmark warped subtly enough to disorient, subtly enough to make my mind scream that I was alone and unmoored. The mist thickened, curling around my boots, climbing my legs. Shadows pressed to the edges of perception, almost touching me without quite making contact. My flashlight flickered again. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to make sense of the movement. And then, just for a heartbeat, I saw one shape turn toward me, head tilting impossibly, eyes, if they could be called eyes, hollow and black, focused entirely on me. My throat tightened, a dry, rasping sound escaping when I tried to breathe. I stumbled back, heart racing, tripping over uneven pavement. The shadows didn't move directly toward me. They didn't need to. Their awareness was enough. It pressed on my chest, curling at the base of my skull, a subtle, insistent weight that made my legs shake. Every instinct screamed to run, but my feet felt leaden, trapped, aware that moving might provoke something beyond comprehension. I tried call for backup, reaching for the radio on my belt. Static hissed in response. No voices, no instructions, no reassurance. Just a low, curling hiss, almost a whisper, wrapping around my ears. I swallowed hard, pressing the radio to my chest, trying to ground myself, but the alley offered no refuge. The mist, the shadows, the impossible shapes, they were patient, deliberate, aware, and I was fully in their sights. A sudden gust of wind swirled through the alley, curling the mist into twisting ribbons. Shadows bent with it, elongated unnaturally, stretching across walls and streetlights in impossible angles. My flashlight beam trembled. I felt my pulse in my throat. And then, just for a fleeting moment, I thought I heard footsteps. Not mine, not following mine, light, deliberate, circling around. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. Silence, but the awareness remained, pressing lightly at the edges of perception, reminded me that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to keep moving, slow, careful steps along the narrow alley. Each turn, each corner, revealed shapes that warped, twisted, moved in ways that defied the geometry of the alleyways I'd walked 1,000 times. Walls seemed closer, narrower. Light stretched and skewed. Shadows multiplied, curling toward me, moving without cause, lingering even when I looked away. A whisper rose again, curling through the mist, unintelligible but insistent. I pressed my flashlight closer, sweeping the alley in long arcs, trying to make sense of the shapes. They weren't solid, not entirely. Sometimes human, sometimes grotesque parodies of human form. Limbs bent backward, heads tilted, torsos stretched impossibly. Always observing, always patient, always aware. Panic welled up inside me. I turned sharply, heart hammering, ready to retreat. But the alley behind me didn't look familiar. The fog curled differently. Shadows hung heavier, corners bent subtly. I realized then that I wasn't just disoriented. The space itself had shifted, subtly, impossibly. The alleyways were no longer what I remembered, and the shapes, the awareness, had followed every step. I stumbled forward again, chest tight, throat dry. Every shadow, every flicker in the fog, every subtle shift in light pressed awareness into my mind. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I felt them, patient, deliberate, observing, not trying to harm me directly, but marking me, noting me, making me aware that nothing I knew was safe, nothing familiar. Eventually, I reached the end of the alley, a streetlight flickering weakly in the distance. Relief surged, but it was hollow. The mist lingered, the shadows twisted, and the awareness remained. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to shake the weight pressing at my chest. The shapes didn't vanish entirely. They hovered, patient, deliberate, aware, curling in the edges of perception. I walked toward the main street slowly, flashlight beam cutting narrow paths through the fog. I dare not glance back. I knew, instinctively, that any look might provoke the shapes, might draw their attention more directly. Each step felt heavy, burdened by the knowledge of the alleyways, the shadows, the fog. They weren't just empty spaces. They were occupied by something patient, something aware, something impossible. Even as I reached open streets again, where the fog thinned and the world returned to normalcy, the weight lingered, patient, deliberate, observing. And I knew that the alleyways, the shapes, the impossible awareness would not be confined to that space. They followed, lingering in memory, pressing in subtle waves on my mind, curling into the corners of perception, patient, deliberate, aware. The night didn't end for me when I left the alleys. It continued in the shadows and the fog, in the empty spaces of streets and corners, pressing awareness into every step, every breath, every thought. And I realized with a sinking certainty that I had been marked, observed, and nothing, not sleep, not distance, not rational thought, could erase away that patient, deliberate awareness. I never expected an alleyway could lead to something like this. The narrow streets had felt wrong the moment I entered them, and the whispers that had curled around me like smoke seemed to push me toward the end. That's when I saw it. The shop, forgotten, abandoned, the kind of place you'd walk past 1,000 times without noticing. Its windows were grimy, but faint light flickered inside, moving as though something or someone was stirring. I slowed my pace, flashlight sweeping across the facade. The paint was chipped, letters peeling from the sign above, half of it missing entirely. Yet there was a warmth emanating from the interior, subtle, almost magnetic, the kind of warmth that felt alive, not comforting, alive in a way that suggested awareness, a presence waiting, patient, deliberate. My hand rested on the door handle. The metal was cold, surprisingly so, and I hesitated. Something in the air made my skin prickle. I could almost hear the faint rustle of movement inside, soft, deliberate, like the shop itself was breathing. I swallowed, forcing myself to turn the knob. The door creaked open, protesting after years of disuse, and I stepped inside. Darkness wrapped around me immediately, but the flashlight cut a narrow path through it. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by my presence, swirling in ghostly tendrils. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty, but every so often I saw objects, a broken teacup, a jar of nails, a torn book that seemed out of place. Not old like the building, but moved, touched, arranged recently. Signs of life in a place that should have been dead. I took a slow step forward. The floorboards groaned, echoing unnaturally in the small space. I swung the flashlight across the room. A chair was tipped over, a faint scuff on the floor suggesting it had been dragged. And then I noticed it. A series of footprints, small, narrow, not quite human in proportion, pressed lightly into the dust, leading toward the back of the shop. Leading me in, I felt my chest tighten. Logic screamed that no one could have been here. No one should have been here. Yet the signs of life were undeniable. I followed the footprints, careful, deliberate. Each step felt like crossing a threshold. The whispers rose again, soft, curling around the edges of perception. Not words, not sentences, just awareness. Patient, deliberate, observing. The back of the shop was darker, the air heavier, as if the space itself had changed. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam flickering over crates stacked impossibly high, shadows bending at odd angles. And then I saw a movement. Not a person, not entirely. Something shifted among the shelves, a blur that bent around corners without emerging fully, like the mist from the alleys had followed me inside. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep moving. My mind raced with every possible explanation, rats, wind, hallucination, but none of them fit. The shop seemed aware of me. Every sound I made, every shift of light, every breath I drew was met with subtle response. Shelves groaned softly. Dust rose from corners I hadn't disturbed. Footsteps, light, careful, circling, echoed in places that should have been empty. I reached a small counter at the back. Papers, old receipts, and jars were scattered across it. One of the jars rolled slightly, as if nudged by invisible fingers. I froze, heart hammering. The whispers swelled, curling around my mind, patient, deliberate. I couldn't see the source, yet I knew it was aware, watching, waiting, not threatening yet, but insistent in a way that made my stomach churn. The room felt alive, not in the sense of electricity or ventilation, but alive in the subtle way that awareness can make a space oppressive. My flashlight flickered, and when the beam returned, a shadow, no figure, stood at the edge of the light, just a form, darker than darkness itself, bending in ways a body shouldn't. And it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me, seeing every thought, every heartbeat, every inch of tension in my chest. I stepped back, pulse racing. My breath caught in my throat as the figure shifted, moving without walking, gliding, or perhaps existing in a space slightly offset from mine. I tried to call out, voice trembling. Hello? Anyone here? Nothing. Only the soft curl of whispers, brushing around my ears like smoke. My rational mind screamed at me to leave. Every instinct in my body urged flight. But my feet stayed rooted, trapped by the weight of awareness pressing against the edges of perception. The figure moved closer. Or perhaps I moved closer. I couldn't tell. Space in the shop bent subtly, impossibly. Shadows deepened in corners, stretching across walls and floors in ways that made my stomach churn. And then I noticed the mirrors. Not mirrors as in reflections, but shards of glass placed meticulously around the shop, reflecting light and shadow in strange, twisting ways. In each shard the figure or figures multiplied, bending, stretching, tilting heads impossibly, patient, deliberate, aware. I forced a step backward, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. The whispers rose again, curling in the back of my mind. They weren't words, not yet, but awareness itself had a sound, a weight, a presence, and I felt it in every nerve ending, every muscle, every breath. The shop wasn't just abandoned. It had learned. It had waited, and now it knew I was here. I tried to focus on the mundane. Shelves, jars, papers, anything ordinary. But ordinary didn't exist anymore. Every object seemed placed with intent. Every shadow bent subtly toward me. Footsteps echoed in corners I hadn't disturbed. A jar rattled softly on the counter. The whispers swelled, patient, deliberate, almost teasing. My chest tightened. My throat dried. I realized then that the shop wasn't just alive. It was aware, and I was intruding. I backed toward the door, trying to convince myself I could leave. But the alley outside had shifted in memory. The doorway felt farther, distorted, as the space itself resisted my escape. And in that moment, I saw something impossible. In the reflection of a shard of glass, a figure, pale, hollow-eyed, patient, leaned from the darkness, tilting its head to watch me, not moving toward me, not threatening, just observing. I knew that gaze would follow me, always, patient and deliberate. My hands shook as I gripped the doorknob. The whispers were all around me now, curling in my mind, impossible to ignore. I pulled, swung the door open, and stumbled into the alley outside. The fog had returned, thick and curling, stretching in all directions. Shadows twisted among the mist. Shapes that had no right to exist flickered at the edges of perception. The shop behind me seemed aware, waiting, patient. I forced myself to move forward, heart hammering, flashlight cutting narrow paths through the mist. Each step carried weight, not just from fear, but from the understanding that what I had seen couldn't be left behind entirely. The shop wasn't just a place. It was a presence, and it had noticed me. By the time I returned to familiar streets, the mist had thinned, and the world returned to its mundane rhythm. Yet the weight of awareness pressed at my chest. Every shadow, every reflection, every corner light carried echoes of the shop's presence. I knew it had followed me in some way, not in form, but in consciousness. Patient, deliberate, watching. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see it in the corners of my mind. The shards of glass, the shadows bending impossibly, the figure that watches without moving. The whispers curl at the edge of my thoughts, patient, deliberate, aware. And I know, without doubt, that the forgotten shop isn't just behind me anymore. It's inside me, lingering in memory and perception, impossible to shake, always observing, always patient. I thought leaving the alleyways, leaving the fog and impossible shadows behind me, would end it. I thought the night would return to ordinary. I was wrong. Every step I took, every turn I made, the sound followed. Footsteps, not my own, not echoing mine. Distinct, measured, patient. They weren't random. They weren't careless. They tracked me. At first, I convinced myself it was paranoia, exhaustion, fear from the alley, the fog, the shapes. But the sound persisted, soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the hum of the city at night. Tap, 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 echoing in the silent streets, matching my pace. I slowed, listening. It slowed. I stopped. It stopped. My pulse thundering. I tried moving again. The footsteps resumed, matching me step for step, deliberate, patient, aware. I turned corners sharply, tried doubling back, half running down side streets. But no matter how fast I moved, they kept pace. The sound was always behind me, but not behind me. Somewhere close enough that awareness pressed against the back of my skull, tightening, curling, making each breath a conscious effort. I could feel them, patient and deliberate, aware, and I couldn't see them. The streetlights flickered as I passed. Shadows elongated in unnatural ways. Every alleyway and doorway seemed to breathe subtly, opening and closing around me. The footsteps remained soft but insistent, weaving into the soundscape of the night, pressing against perception in a way that made rational thought impossible. I tried calling out, voice cracking, hoarse from fear. Who's there? Silence, except the patient echo of measured steps. I ducked into a narrow alley, hoping to lose them, hoping the walls would trap the sound. But the alley warped subtly as I passed. Pavement seemed to stretch, corners bent just slightly, impossible enough to disorient. And then the footsteps accelerated, not faster than me, but sharper, closer, curling into the edges of my mind, awareness pressing at me, watching, waiting, patient. I stumbled, almost tripping over a trash bin. The sound of my own clumsy steps blended into theirs. For a moment, I couldn't tell which footsteps belonged to me, which were the shadows following. The distinction blurred. And then I realized it didn't matter. It had already infiltrated my perception. My senses were no longer entirely my own. Something else had learned the rhythm of my body, the beat of my heart, the pace of my breath, and it used that knowledge to mirror me, to haunt me. I forced myself to keep moving, despite every instinct screaming to stop. My chest burned, lungs tight, mind reeling. Every corner I rounded seemed subtly different than memory. Familiar streets twisted, warped. Shadows clung longer than they should, shapes flickering at the edges of light. The footsteps followed, always following, never faltering. Patient, deliberate, aware. I reached a bridge over a quiet canal. Water shimmered faintly beneath the lights, reflecting distorted shapes. I paused, leaning against the railing, trying to gather myself. The footsteps stopped. I dared to look over my shoulder. Nothing, only the darkened streets, empty. Relief washed over me, tentative and fragile. But then I stepped forward again. Tap, tap, tap. Behind me, matching me, following me. Panic bubbled in my chest. My hands trembled. I wanted to scream, to run blindly, but the awareness pressed against me. Patient, deliberate, watching. I realized then that speed or distance didn't matter. The presence, whatever it was bound to me, not in the streets, not in the alleyways, but in my perception, my awareness. Wherever I went, it would be there, coiling at the edges of thought, patient, deliberate, watching. I tried thinking rationally. Footsteps can echo. Footsteps can be mimicked. But these weren't echoes. They weren't mimicry. They followed me even when I sprinted, slowed when I slowed, stopped when I stopped, and always behind me, but not far enough to be ignored. The wave of awareness pressed in, subtle but unrelenting. I turned sharply into another alley, hoping to confuse it, shake it. The mist had returned here, curling low, brushing my boots, carrying the faint smell of something damp and metallic. Tap, tap, tap. Faster now. Sharper. Not chasing me directly. Not attacking. But tracking, observing, patient, deliberate. I could feel it pressing against the base of my skull, curling around my thoughts, making decision and fear inseparable. I stumbled out onto a wider street, heart hammering. I tried shouting, tried rational explanation. There's no one there. My voice cracked, swallowed by night. The footsteps matched me again, closer, echoing in every empty space, patient, deliberate. I couldn't see them. I couldn't know their form, but I knew they existed, knew they were bound to me. I ducked into the shadows of a side street, hoping darkness would hide me, hoping for a moment of reprieve. But the awareness didn't need sight. It knew. Footsteps echoed softly, circling around me. Not direct, not aggressive, but impossible to escape. They were in the spaces between walls, in the shadows stretching from streetlights, in the slight bends of pavement. Patient, deliberate, aware. My breaths came shallow, rapid. Sweat ran cold down my spine. I forced myself to focus on the mundane. Lampposts, parked cars, familiar buildings. But each object seemed subtly wrong, stretched, tilted, bending perception just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. The footsteps followed, always following, an audible weight pressing at the edges of reality. I ran, full sprint, down streets I knew, down streets I didn't. Tap, 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 behind me, matching me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always patient, deliberate, aware. I tried throwing off my rhythm, turning sharply, doubling back. Nothing worked. Distance didn't matter. I realized then with icy certainty that the presence wasn't tied to space. It was tied to me, to my awareness, to my perception of movement, fear, and thought. I stumbled into a small park, dark and empty. Trees swayed gently, mist curling around roots and benches. I pressed myself against a trunk, heart hammering, hands trembling. Tap, 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 softer now. Circling, patient, deliberate, aware. I could feel it in my chest, in my ears, in the tension curling my muscles. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't speaking. It didn't need to. The simple act of being present, observing, was enough to unnerve, to trap me in perpetual dread. I sank to ground, pressing my head into my knees, trying steady breathing. The footsteps continued, subtle, impossible to ignore. I realized I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. Wherever I went, whatever street, alley, or park, it would follow. Always patient, always deliberate, always aware. And I knew, deep in my core, that it had marked me, observed me, learned the rhythm of my existence. Time became meaningless. The night stretched indefinitely. Tap, 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 circling, observing, pressing awareness into every nerve ending. My flashlight lay forgotten on the ground, beams slicing weakly through mist, shadows bending, stretching, watching. I could no longer trust perception. The world had warped subtly, impossibly. Every step I took was mirrored, observed, pressed upon by something patient, deliberate, aware. By the faint light of approaching dawn, I staggered back onto a main street. The footsteps stopped, or perhaps I had just grown numb to their presence. But the weight of awareness lingered, coiling in my chest, pressing lightly but unrelentingly. I knew then that it would not relent, that it would follow me always, not necessarily in physical space, but in perception, in thought, in the subtle curl of dread that accompanied every movement. I had learned one thing. Running didn't work. Turning corners didn't work. Escaping streets and alleys didn't matter. The presence that had learned the rhythm of my steps, the cadence of my heart, the tension in my chest, was patient, deliberate, bound to me, and it would never leave. Even now, I hear it, in the quiet corners of memory, in the subtle curl of awareness when the night is still. Tap, 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 following steps that aren't mine, yet match mine perfectly. Patient, deliberate, aware, and I know with certainty that I will never be free. I didn't think I could make it. Every muscle screamed, lungs burned, and my heart pounded as though trying to break free from my chest. The alleyways, the fog, the impossible shadows, they had followed me long enough, pressing awareness into every step, every breath, every thought. And now, finally I saw it, an exit. The main street ahead, dimly lit but familiar. I forced my legs to carry me forward, adrenaline and fear making me fly past twisted corners and warped pavement. The moment I stepped into the open street, the heavy weight that had pressed against my skull lessened slightly. The footsteps, the patient, deliberate echo, had stopped. Or maybe I had just put enough distance between me and them. My chest heaved as I slowed, flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam cutting weakly through the remaining mist. My mind fought to convince me it was over, that I had escaped, that the alleyways, the shapes, the whispers had been bound to that narrow stretch of streets and fog. I was wrong. Even as I put space between myself and the alleys, the whispers returned, not loud, not coherent, but curling around my consciousness. Subtle, patient, deliberate. They weren't coming from anywhere. They weren't carried by the wind or the buildings. They existed inside my head, inside the folds of awareness that the alleyways had pressed into my mind. I could feel them in every pulse, every nerve ending, every breath. I stumbled down the main street. Try to ignore them. Try to focus on ordinary things. The flicker of a streetlight, the hum of a distant car, the rustle of leaves in a gutter. But the whispers threaded themselves through all of it, curling and shifting, patient, deliberate, aware. No amount of distance, no familiar streets, no open space could sever their presence. It was a thread woven into my perception, and it tugged constantly, subtly, impossibly. I passed a convenience store, its lights flickering, buzzing faintly. The reflection in the glass made me start. Shapes impossible, stretched, bending, hovered just at the edge of my sight. I blinked. They were gone. Or perhaps they never left. Perhaps they had simply moved with me, patient and deliberate, aware in the corners of vision I could not trust. My stomach churned as I forced myself to look straight ahead, focusing on the path forward. Never back. Never back. I tried to call someone. Anyone. My radio, my phone. I needed reassurance, some anchor to reality. But silence. Or worse. Static curling faintly into whispers, almost words, almost phrases, threading into my mind. I clenched the device tightly, my knuckles white, trying to force it to function, to tell me I wasn't alone. But I was alone, alone with awareness that had followed me beyond the alleys, beyond the fog, into the normal world that had no right to harbor such things. I forced myself to walk faster, heart hammering, every nerve screaming, but my mind functioning in that narrow corridor of pure instinct. Don't look back. Keep moving. Keep breathing. The whispers pressed, curling into the edges of perception, patient and deliberate. I could feel them in my chest, threading around thoughts, tugging at memory, planting doubt, twisting logic. The alleyways had left their mark, and the mark lingered. A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the faint scent of damp concrete and decay. My pulse spiked, head snapping toward the source. Nothing, only the rustle of leaves, only shadows stretching unnaturally under streetlights. But I could feel them, patient, deliberate, aware, waiting, observing. And I knew, deep in some corner of my mind, that distance or daylight could not erase them. I passed a park, benches empty, trees swaying gently in the night air, and for a fleeting heartbeat, I imagined them there, shapes bending impossibly among the shadows, twisting in ways that mocked physics, patient and deliberate. My stomach clenched, my legs shook. I wanted to run, to sprint blindly, to throw myself into the safety of distance and noise. But I knew impossibly that it would follow, always, in perception, in memory, in whispers curling through the skull. I reached a streetlight and stopped, pressing my forehead against a metal pole, trying to force my racing mind to slow. Every breath I drew carried tension. Every heartbeat thudded with awareness I could not shake. The whispers were soft now, like smoke curling at the edges of thought. Subtle, patient, deliberate, inside my mind, impossible to locate, impossible to ignore. I realized then that escaping the alleyways had been a mistake in one sense. I had carried them with me. They weren't bound to place. They were bound to me, I force myself forward again, one slow step at a time. Focus on the mundane. The cracked pavement beneath my boots. The flicker of distant traffic lights. The warm hum of a passing car. But even as I force rational thought, the awareness pressed. Every shadow I passed stretched faintly, bending perception. Every reflection caught in a window flickered impossibly, twisting shapes that weren't mine. And beneath it all, the whispers threaded their way into memory, into fear, into the subtle curl of dread that now accompanied every step. Hours, or maybe minutes. Time no longer made sense. Passed. I reached a familiar neighborhood. Streetlights steady. Houses quiet. I tried to convince myself the whispers would fade here, that in the presence of ordinary life, normalcy, they would lose their hold. But the whispers lingered. Patient, deliberate, aware, curling through perception, threading into memory, impossible to silence. I realized then that escape had no meaning. I had moved, yes, but the weight had followed. I entered my building, fumbled with keys, heart hammering, head pressed low. Inside, familiar walls, ordinary furniture, the mundane smell of a lived-in space. Relief fragile, surface, but the whispers pressed closer. Not audible, not physical, but awareness. Patient, deliberate, observing, always aware. I could feel it in the way shadows leaned subtly toward corners, in the faint flicker of light across the ceiling. I had brought it home. I had carried it through the streets, through fog and alleyways, and it now lingered inside the spaces I knew best. Sleep offered no reprieve. Lying in bed, I felt the curl of awareness brush at my skull. Patient, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Shadows in corners bent subtly. Light flickered on familiar objects in ways that shouldn't be possible. And the whispers threaded through my thoughts, soft, insistent, curling around memory. Not words, but pressure. Not sentences, but awareness. Always aware, always patient, always deliberate. I learned quickly not to move toward sounds that shouldn't exist, not to focus on shadows bending slightly, not to follow instinct. All that did was draw attention, anchor the awareness. Now, I lie in bed, eyes open, listening to silence that is never silent. Footsteps echo faintly in memory. Shadows stretch where none should exist. Whispers curl softly, patient, deliberate, aware. Even now, when the sun rises, when ordinary life presses against me, I cannot shake it. The alleyways, the shapes, the fog, they are gone. But the mark remains, a presence threaded through perception, awareness curling through memory. Patient, deliberate, observing. I never look back. I never check the edges of the street. I never enter an alley alone. Not because it might be there physically, but because I know it is always with me. In perception, in thought, in the subtle curl of dread that will never leave. I have learned one thing about fear. It doesn't always strike in the moment. Sometimes it lingers, patient, deliberate, aware, shaping every heartbeat, every shadow, every whisper of memory. I escaped the alleyways, yes, but the whispers did not escape. They follow me still, inside my mind, curling at the edges of awareness, patient, deliberate, aware. And I know, as long as I draw breath, they will never leave. I cannot look back. I cannot stop moving forward. I can only exist with a constant, curling dread threading itself through perception, threading itself into the spaces I once called safe. And so I move forward, patiently, deliberately, aware, never looking back. I arrive at the checkpoint just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised mix of purples and grays. The station sat alone on the outskirts of the city, a small hut with flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by cracked asphalt and empty fields that stretched into darkness. From the outside, it looked like any other night shift post. Quiet, uneventful, predictable. But I've learned that quiet is never safe, not in a place like this. The first few minutes were almost peaceful. The wind whispered across the empty lot, rustling the weeds that grew through cracks in concrete. My boots echoed softly against the pavement as I made my rounds, checking gates and fences, testing radios, and scanning the horizon with my flashlight. Everything felt ordinary, almost too ordinary. I leaned against the railing, arms crossed, letting the flashlight rest in my hand. The air smelled of damp earth and something faintly metallic. I couldn't place it exactly, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind, just the shift settling in, just the isolation playing tricks on a tired mind. But there was a weight to the night, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the darkness had awareness, as if it was leaning in, curious about my presence. I checked the monitors inside the hut. Most cameras were focused on gates or fences, flickering between static and dimly lit corners. Nothing unusual appeared. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back, stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. The calm should have reassured me. And yet, every so often, a shadow at the edge of the screen made me pause, heart stuttering, only to vanish when I blinked. The radio crackled faintly. I lifted the receiver. Checkpoint 1, do you copy? The voice was faint, distant, almost like it was coming from far away. I responded quickly, voice steady. Copy, all quiet here. Nothing but static answered. I lowered the receiver, unease curling in my stomach. I stepped outside again, flashlight sweeping across the empty lot. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound I couldn't place. A scrape? A soft tap? My heart rate quickened, but the lot remained empty, save for shadows stretching long and dark under the weak glow of the lamps. I tried to tell myself it was a branch, a loose piece of debris, but the sound had a rhythm, deliberate, patient, almost conscious. I moved toward the edge of the lot, flashlight illuminating the overgrown grass that bordered the cracked asphalt. The deeper I went, the more the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against me in subtle ways. My steps slowed instinctively. The night felt alive, aware, watching. I swallowed hard, trying to force rational thought. Nothing was there. Nothing should be there. And yet, something shifted in the shadows, something patient, deliberate, aware. Returning to the hut, I tried to settle into the routine. I made notes in my log, checked the fences again, and adjusted cameras that had drifted slightly. Every action felt normal, methodical, but my ears caught every creak, every faint whistle of wind, every soft rustle from the overgrown edges. The calm was deceptive. The stillness was patient. The night was aware of my presence, curling around me, watching without moving. Minutes stretched, hours, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in isolation, passed without incident. And then, almost imperceptibly, the air shifted. A distant tap, like a boot scuffing against concrete, echoed faintly. I froze, flashlight shaking in my hand. Tap, tap, another sound. Closer this time, deliberate, measured. My pulse quickened. I scanned the lot, but nothing moved. Only shadows stretching, bending subtly where they shouldn't. I tried to rationalize it. An animal, the wind. But deep down, I knew rational thought would offer little protection tonight. I stepped outside again, boots crunching softly on the cracked asphalt, flashlight sweeping left to right. The lot was empty, silent, and yet the wave of awareness pressed against me, patient, deliberate, aware. My stomach churned as I realized the night wasn't just quiet. It was observing. Every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle movement was registered, cataloged, and I felt the pressure of that awareness, curling around me, impossible to ignore. I moved closer to the edge of the field, where the tall grass whispered under the breeze. A shadow flickered at the corner of my eye, gone when I turned fully. I held my breath, trying to make sense of the sensation. The night hummed softly, carrying whispers too faint to understand but impossible to dismiss. They weren't words, not yet, just a presence, patient and deliberate, aware. I took a cautious step back, flashlight sweeping over every inch of the lot, every inch of darkness. Nothing, but the feeling remained, coiling in my chest, pressing against the edges of perception. Inside the hut, I tried to refocus. Monitors, logs, radios, anything mundane to anchor me. I ran my hands over the keyboard, checked camera angles, tapped the receiver. All normal, all quiet, but the awareness persisted. Patient, deliberate, watching. It curled around my senses, threading into perception, threading into thought. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, couldn't name it, but I could feel it always at the edge of consciousness. I decided to take a short break, leaning against a counter, flashlight resting across my knees. I let my mind drift, trying to convince myself of ordinary explanations. The wind, the fatigue, my imagination. But rational thought failed me. The night pressed closer, subtle, insistent. Shadows flickered, shapes bent, angles seemed impossible. And I realized that this calm, this eerie stillness, was a trap of awareness. It had noticed me, it had learned me, and it was waiting. A distant sound made me freeze. A soft thump, like something heavy placed carefully on the asphalt. My heart skipped. I swept the flashlight across the lot, scanning carefully. Nothing. Only shadows bending gently, impossibly. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself to move, to check the source, to maintain control. But the weight of the night made every step feel heavy, deliberate. The calm was deceptive. The ordinary was alive, patient, deliberate, aware. Hours stretched further. Every sound, every flicker of light, every shift in shadow pressed against me. I realized then that routine offered no protection. No amount of methodical checks, no amount of logs or monitors could alter the subtle curl of dread that threaded through the night. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The presence, the awareness, was patient, deliberate, and inside my mind as much as the lot itself. I found myself wandering outside again, flashlights sweeping over asphalt, fences, and the edge of the fields. The wind whispered faintly, carrying impossible hints of movement, soft, deliberate, patient. I froze repeatedly, scanning shadows, checking corners, tracing impossible angles with my eyes. And every time, the awareness tightened slightly, pressing, curling, observing, not threatening, not yet, but impossible to ignore. By the time the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon, I was exhausted. My mind raced. My chest ached. Every shadow, every whisper, every subtle shift in the night had registered, threaded into memory, into perception. And even as the sun rose, even as ordinary life crept into horizon, the sense of being observed lingered, patient, deliberate, aware. I learned something during that first shift. Calm in isolation is never neutral. Quiet is never empty. Even in the absence of movement, absence of sound, absence of life, the night carries awareness. And when it notices you, subtle, patient, and deliberate, it leaves a mark, not on your skin, not in your body, but in perception itself. The curl of tension in your mind, the faint pressure of the edges of thought, the whispers that are never quite audible but always present. As I packed up at the end of the shift, stepping into the weak light of morning, I knew one thing with certainty. The checkpoint was ordinary only in appearance. The night, the darkness, the quiet, they were aware, and they had noticed me. Patient, deliberate, observing, waiting. I left the post without looking back, but the awareness trailed me, subtle, curling at the edges of thought, impossible to shake. The first night was calm on the surface, but beneath it, the weight had pressed in. Patient, deliberate, aware, and I knew, before even setting foot on that lot again, that every night would be like this. Quiet, eerie, calm, but with something watching, always learning. The night after my first shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that the checkpoint had eyes even when I wasn't there. The memory of shadows bending just slightly, the subtle curl of awareness pressing at my mind, kept me uneasy as I drove home. Sleep was fitful, restless, filled with fragmented images of alleys and empty asphalt stretching into darkness. By the time I returned for second shift, I was already tense, every nerve ending alert, every breath shallow. The fog had rolled in early that night, a thick, white blanket that clung to the ground, curling around streetlights and stretching into the field beyond the checkpoint. Visibility dropped quickly. The lights from the hut barely penetrated the mist. I moved slowly, flashlight cutting weakly through the gray, trying to keep everything in view. The usual hum of the night, wind, distant traffic, the soft rustle of weeds, was muffled, swallowed by the fog. Silence had weight tonight, heavier than before. I was checking the fence line when I noticed it, a figure, standing at the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching, not moving, not breathing in any visible way, just present. The outline was human enough, tall, straight, but something about it was wrong. The edges seemed to blur, shifting slightly, as though the fog was thickening around it, bending its form. My stomach knotted, pulse spiking. I called out, trying to sound firm, professional. "Hey, can I help you?" No response, just the fog. The figure didn't move, didn't react. I took a cautious step forward. The fog swirled around its legs, curling upward like smoke, but the form remained impossibly still. My instinct screamed to retreat, but something forced me forward, curiosity battling fear. "Who's there?" My voice trembled despite my best effort to stay calm. Still nothing. Silence pressing, patient and deliberate. I raised my flashlight fully, swinging across the figure. It didn't blink. It didn't flinch. I tried to make out details. Face? Clothes? Nothing. Only a vague shape. Human enough to recognize. Alien enough to unsettle every fiber of my being. I took another step forward, hand gripping the flashlight tightly. The fog thickened. The figure didn't advance, didn't retreat. It simply existed there, patient, deliberate, aware. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. My rational mind struggled. Could it be someone lost? A prankster? But the air carried no sound of breathing, no movement, no human scent. Only the faint metallic smell of night air curling around wet grass. I tried again. "Do you need help?" The words sounded hollow in the fog. No reply. I edged closer, and the figure remained. I forced my mind not to imagine movement where there was none, not to let my pulse make shadows bend. But still, awareness pressed in. Something about its presence, patient and deliberate, pressed against the edges of thought, threading into fear without effort. When I got within 10 feet, it happened. The shape dissipated, not running, not walking, simply gone, curling into fog like smoke sucked back into an unseen source. My breath caught, heart thudding wildly. I spun around, scanning the lot. Nothing, only fog, bending and curling, every shadow stretching unnaturally. I called its name. "Wait! Hey!" But only the hum of the night answered. I forced myself to keep moving, flashlight sweeping every inch of the fence, every corner, every patch of overgrown grass. Nothing. The lot seemed unchanged, empty, ordinary. Yet I couldn't shake it. The awareness remained patient, deliberate, pressing subtly against my skull. I had walked right up to it, and it hadn't spoken. It hadn't moved like a human being. It had simply existed and vanished. I returned to the hut, trying to ground myself. Logbook, cameras, radios, anything familiar. I wrote notes about the fog, the figure, my uncertainty. But the act of writing did little to steady the curl of dread threading through my chest. Shadows bent slightly where none should. Monitors flickered with a faint distortion, and my pulse thudded against the hollow silence. Patient, deliberate, aware. Even when unseen, it pressed. I tried rational thought. Could it have been a trick of light? A reflection? A shadow cast strangely by the flickering lamp? Maybe. But the figure had reacted, or rather, had disappeared. At the moment I approached. Human shadows don't vanish. Air doesn't fold around someone in deliberate silence. And the awareness that lingered, coiling in the edges of my mind like smoke. Minutes stretched into hours. Every rustle, every hiss of wind, every faint crack of the lot under my boots felt amplified. My flashlight trembled in my grip, though I tried to convince myself it was fatigue. But deep down, I knew the tension wasn't fatigue. It was awareness. Patient, deliberate, observing, curling around thought, threading into every corner of perception. I stepped outside again, flashlight sweeping carefully across the fog. Shadows bent slightly in corners, lines of light fractured oddly, every familiar shape subtly distorted. I could feel it. The presence, patient and deliberate, watching. I called out once more. "Hello? Are you?" Nothing. Silence pressed back. thick and unyielding. Yet I could sense the faint pressure, the subtle curl of dread threading along my nerves. I walked the perimeter slowly, every instinct screaming to move quickly, to escape, to run. But the rational part of my mind forced patience, observation, documentation, even in the absence of movement. The fog, the lot, and the unseen figure taught me that danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was patient. Sometimes it simply existed, aware, deliberate, curling the edges of thought without overt action. By the time I returned to the hut, my flashlight being weak and shaking, I realized the figure wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was part of the night here, part of the awareness threaded into every shadow, every bend in the asphalt, every curl of fog. And even though I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it clearly, I could feel it, patient, deliberate, pressing subtly into my mind. I sat at the desk, hands shaking slightly, trying to focus on the cameras. Each monitor flickered in dim, gray light. Empty, but the edges, just at corner vision, seemed to ripple, bend, shift. The fog had carried its form into my perception. The awareness had marked me. And I knew that once noticed, there was no forgetting. Patient, deliberate, always aware. The remainder of the shift passed in uneasy vigilance. I moved deliberately, checked every corner, every fence post, every monitor, flashlight sweeping constantly. Every sound was amplified, every shadow stretched unnaturally. And always at the edge of thought, awareness lingered, not threatening yet, not active, but patient, deliberate, and aware. I felt in the curl of tension that accompanied every step, and the faint pull of dread threading through the night. By the end of my shift, when the fog had begun to lift slightly with the promise of dawn, I stepped outside for the final check. The lot was empty, ordinary, no trace of the figure, no sign of movement. And yet I knew that it had been there. I had felt it, and I would feel it again. Patient, deliberate, observing, always aware. I left the checkpoint slowly, avoiding looking back. Not because I feared seeing it again, though part of me did, but because the awareness lingered regardless of sight. It didn't need to speak, didn't need to move. Its mark was threaded into perception, into memory, into thought. The fog, the night, the patience of whatever had observed me. Those would follow me forever in subtle, curling ways, shaping the edges of every quiet moment. Even now, hours later, I can feel it. Patient, deliberate, aware, waiting just beyond perception, curling in the corners of memory, whispering in a language I cannot yet understand. I can't see it, I can't track it, I can't name it. But I know it is there, as real as the pulse in my chest, as tangible as the darkness pressing against the edges of the lot. And I know that one day, if I am careless, if I let curiosity or fear dominate, I might see it again. The fog lifts, but the awareness remains. Patient, deliberate, always aware. The third night at the checkpoint began with the same uneasy routine. Sweeping the lot with my flashlight, checking fences and gates, scanning monitors, noting the fog curling around the edges of the asphalt. But the night was already different. The air felt heavier, more patient, as though the darkness itself had grown aware of my anticipation. I couldn't shake the memory of the figure in the fog, or the way its presence had pressed against the edges of my mind the night before. I had just settled into the hut, feet up briefly on the counter, logbook open, when the radio crackled. Not the usual static hiss or the distant, muffled voices of other posts. This was different. Garbled at first, barely audible, then sharper, more urgent. I froze, hands tightening on the receiver. Checkpoint 1, do you copy? My voice sounded brittle even to me. The reply wasn't in words I could understand. It was distorted, frantic, a jumble of syllables curling over each other like smoke. But there was intent behind it. Panic, urgency, a thread of intelligence woven into the static. I leaned closer, straining to catch meaning. Every hair on my arm stood on end. Something in the pattern of the garble wasn't random. It was aware of me, deliberate, patient, yes, but pressed with an insistence that made my stomach knot. I lowered the receiver slowly, heart hammering, and glanced at the lot. Shadows stretched at the corners of the floodlights. bending subtly in ways that made my chest tighten. I wasn't imagining it. The shadows were moving independently of the fog, swaying slightly as though something hidden beyond the beams of light was circling, patient, deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I raised the radio again, pressing the talk button. "Aye, who's there? Identify yourself." My voice cracked. The response came as a sharp burst of static, fragmented words that I couldn't comprehend. And then, for a heartbeat, the static paused, and I thought I heard a faint whisper, soft, almost human, "Closer." My stomach dropped. I spun the flashlight slowly across the lot. Empty. The fog had thinned slightly, but the edges of the lot seemed darker now, heavier somehow, pressing against my perception. The radio crackled again, and this time I caught a fragment. A syllable, urgent, deliberate, threading through the static. It was close. Too close. I gripped the radio tightly, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to step outside, to run, to call for backup. But rational thought forced me to remain, to observe, to document. Slowly, deliberately, I moved to the window, sweeping the flashlight across the asphalt, across the fence line. Shadows shifted in ways that made no sense, angles bending subtly, curling around the edges of vision. And I felt it. Again, the presence, patient, deliberate, aware. Not just in the lot, not just in the fog, but threading into my own perception, whispering at the edges of thought. The radio sparked violently, then crackled softly. Then the voice, or whatever it was, changed. Words emerged, distorted but audible. "Did not leave, watch." The voice fragmented mid-sentence, twisting into static, then fading entirely. I pressed my ear closer, but it was gone. Only the hiss of white noise remained. My pulse spiked. I could feel the weight of it behind me, pressing subtly against my shoulders, coiling around my spine. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped out of the hut, flashlight sweeping across the lot, every corner, every shadow. The air was thick, the fog curling around the edges like fingers, pressing toward me. The lot was empty, or so it seemed, and yet I could sense it. The awareness I had felt the previous nights had grown sharper, closer. I could feel it circling, patient, deliberate, observing, moving just beyond perception. A soft rustle behind me made me whirl. Flashlight cutting the darkness. Nothing, only the fog curling over weeds and cracked asphalt. My pulse raced. I told myself to stay calm, to move slowly, to keep observing. But instinct screamed that I was being followed, that the awareness had shifted, that it had drawn closer while I had been distracted by the radio. I returned to the hut, radio pressed against my ear. I tried calling out again, voice steady but trembling. "Checkpoint 1. Do you copy?" "Respond." Static hissed back. Then a single syllable emerged, chilling. "Closer." I froze. The word, or the approximation of a word, was unmistakable. Someone or something was aware of me. Not just aware. Intent. Patient. Deliberate. Pressing through perception in ways I could feel, but not see. I tried to reason it out. An animal. Wind over metal. Interference from distant towers. But no explanation fit. Rationality failed. This was deliberate, aware, patient. Something that had learned my routine, my attention, the rhythm of my heartbeat. I stepped back outside again, flashlight sweeping low over the asphalt, careful not to trip. Every shadow flickered oddly, subtly, curling just out of reach of light. The air pressed closer. The static on the radio crackled again, fragmented words that I couldn't parse. But the tone was unmistakable, urgent, frantic, focused on me. I swallowed hard. The awareness was patient, deliberate, observing, and it was closer than ever. I tried scanning the edge of the lot, the field beyond the fence. The fog twisted around the distant trees. My breath caught. Movement? A shadow bent and stretched unnaturally, curling over itself just at the edge of perception. I forced myself not to stare too long, not to acknowledge it too fully. But the pressure in the air, the subtle curl of dread in my chest, told me it had drawn closer. The presence was near now, coiling just behind the light, threading into my perception. I stepped back inside, heart hammering, and leaned against the counter. The radio sparked violently again, then hissed softly. I caught fragments, syllables, whispers, distorted phrases. Watch, follow, close, patient. The urgency was undeniable. It pressed into my skull, curling into my thoughts, threading into my awareness. I realized that the fog, the lot, and the shadows were only part of it. The awareness had marked me. It had drawn close. It had learned. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell, passed as I alternated between scanning the lot and listening to the radio. Each crackle, each fragmented voice, each subtle movement of shadows pressed deeper into my perception. I was no longer alone, not in the conventional sense. Something was aware, patient, deliberate, observing, and I could not escape it. Not even in the open, not even under the steady glare of the hut's lights. Finally, in a moment of both fear and clarity, I stepped outside fully, flashlights sweeping low, methodical. Every shadow seemed to stretch, curl, bend just beyond the light. The fog swirled around the edges of perception, and I felt it, aware, patient, deliberate, hovering close. I called out again, voice steadier than I felt. "Who's there? Show yourself." No response, only the curling awareness, threading into my nerves, pressing into thought. I took a deep breath. Rationality offered no comfort. Fear had become methodical. Observation had become survival. And still, the radio crackled, fragments of urgent voices threading through the static. Patient, deliberate, observing. I spent the remainder of the shift moving slowly, methodically, flashlights sweeping, every shadow and flicker noted, every crackle in the radio logged. Nothing approached directly, nothing struck overtly, but awareness was close now, almost tangible, curling around perception like smoke, threading into thought, patient, deliberate, impossible to ignore. By the time the first pale light of dawn brushed the horizon, I was exhausted, shaking, mentally raw, and still the awareness lingered. Not gone, not retreating. Patient, deliberate, observing. Even as the fog lifted, even as daylight pressed into the lot, I knew that it had learned me, that it had drawn close, and that it would be waiting. I left the checkpoint slowly that morning, avoiding the edges of the lot, avoiding shadows. But the presence pressed subtly against my memory, against the rhythm of my heartbeat. It wasn't just outside anymore. It had threaded into perception, into thought, into the faint curl of dread that would follow me into every quiet corner of the day. The radios, the shadows, the fog, they were only the beginning. The awareness was close, patient, deliberate, and it had marked me. By the time my fourth shift rolled around, I had grown accustomed to the subtle weight of awareness pressing against my mind. The lot, the fog, the shadows, even the radios, their distorted voices and urgent static, had left marks. They threaded themselves into thought, curling around perception like smoke. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that fatigue and nerves were playing tricks. But deep down I knew better. The presence I had felt was patient, deliberate, and it followed me, whether I saw it or not. The night started quietly, deceptively so. The fog was thinner tonight, curling around the edges of the lot like a timid visitor. The air smelled of wet asphalt and the faint metallic tang of distant lights. I moved slowly through my usual routine, flashlights sweeping every inch of ground, monitors flickering softly with gray, static light images of the lot. Every sound seemed amplified, wind shifting through broken fence panels, the distant scuff of tires, the faint hum of power lines. Nothing alarming. Yet, I checked the radios first, anticipating static, garbled voices, something to remind me that I was never entirely alone. The crackle came almost immediately, faint but deliberate, a whisper threaded through the hiss. I froze. The word was indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, patient, deliberate, observing. My pulse quickened. I gripped the radio tighter, pressing the talk button, my voice tight, controlled despite the tremor in my hands. Checkpoint 1. "This is Officer. Do you copy?" Only static answered, curling like smoke around my consciousness. I lowered the receiver, heart hammering, and stepped outside briefly to scan the lot. Shadows bent subtly, unnaturally, at the edges of the floodlights. The awareness was here tonight, closer than it had ever been, coiling around perception, threading into nerves. I forced myself to move slowly, scanning every corner, every patch of cracked asphalt, every distant tree line at the edge of the fog. Nothing overt, only subtle shifts, bending of light, faint distortion of shapes. I returned to the hut and tried to ground myself. Logbook, monitors, checklist, everything familiar, everything routine, and yet nothing felt safe. The lot had changed in ways I couldn't name. A fence panel seemed just slightly twisted. A light flickered in a pattern that made no sense, and shadows pooled more deeply in certain corners, as if the air itself had grown heavier. My mind grasped for rational explanations, wind, mechanical issues, fatigue, but none fit. The awareness lingered, patient, deliberate, impossible to shake. During my rounds, I noticed something strange. The edge of the lot, where the fog curled and twisted, seemed denser, thicker, darker than it should have been. Shapes formed in the periphery, indistinct but deliberate. One corner of the asphalt appeared slightly sunken, almost as if the ground had shifted. I crouched to inspect, shining the flashlight closer. Nothing tangible, no footprints, no marks. Only the sense of being watched, threaded into the space itself. I moved on slowly, flashlight beams sweeping over the fence line. Every so often, the static on the radios would flare briefly, distorted syllables or fragments of words. Urgent, patient, deliberate, threading in perception like a whisper that couldn't be ignored. I realized that the presence was more than just in the fog, more than just shadows or distorted radio signals. It had woven itself into the environment, threading to the lot, the air, the corners of my vision, and finally into my thoughts. I returned to the hut for another check of the cameras. Monitors flickered, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw a figure in the background of the lot, just beyond the reach of light, blurred and indistinct. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Nothing, but the memory lingered, curling into my awareness. Patient, deliberate, observing. I realized that even when unseen, the presence had marked the space, shaping perception, bending familiarity into subtle unease. By the midpoint of the shift, the fog had begun to creep back across the lot, curling around fence posts, threading between weeds and cracks. The radios crackled sporadically, fragments of voice, urgent and distorted. I kept my flashlight moving, careful not to focus too long in one spot, careful not to let awareness settle too heavily in one place. And yet every so often, the feeling pressed stronger, coiling around my spine, threading through my skull, tightening in my chest. Patient, deliberate, aware. I stepped outside again for the final rounds, flashlight cutting a weak path through fog and shadow. The lot appeared unchanged, mundane, routine. But nothing was unchanged. The air carried the subtle curl of something unseen, something patient. Shapes shifted in peripheral vision. Shadows pooled in corners. The faint scent of metallic air deepened. Every instinct told me that leaving would not erase it, that walking away would not unthread the awareness from the environment. I paused mid-lot, flashlight beam scanning slowly, deliberately. The shadows at the edge of the floodlights shifted ever so slightly. A faint hum threaded through the radio static, almost musical, almost intentional. My chest tightened. The presence was here, patient and deliberate, not overtly threatening, not striking, simply existing, observing, curling the edges of perception into subtle dread. I realized that my mind had adapted to recognize it in every minor distortion, every subtle irregularity. It was impossible to ignore. Returning to the hut, I tried to document everything. Logbook entries, notes on shadow shifts, radio interference, the curl of fog at the edges of perception. My hands shook slightly, pulse hammering in my ears. Rationality insisted on normal explanations, but intuition and fear told me that normal was no longer possible. Something had drawn close, threaded into the environment, and had learned patience. Deliberate, patient, and aware. The final hour of the shift passed in quiet observation. I walked the perimeter one last time, flashlight sweeping over asphalt and fence, Every corner checked meticulously. Shadows bent and shifted subtly, fog curling unusually around fence posts and weeds. The radios hummed intermittently, fragments of distorted voice threading into my perception. I felt it everywhere now, not just in fog or shadows, but in air, in light, in thought. Awareness that followed me from the first night, growing closer, pressing against perception, impossible to unthread. As the first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon, I stepped outside for one last look at the lot. Everything appeared normal. Asphalt cracked in the usual places, weeds stubbornly curling through fences, floodlights still weak but steady. Yet awareness lingered, patient, deliberate, observing, threaded into space and thought. I could feel at the edges of my perception, coiling subtly, waiting. I left the checkpoint slowly, keeping my eyes on the horizon, deliberately avoiding shadows at the edges of the lot. And still, even as sunlight touched the asphalt, I felt it, patient, deliberate, threading itself subtly into memory. It had marked the environment, bent perception, woven unease into routine. The lot would appear mundane to anyone else. To me, it was already haunted. I glanced back once, only once, before the early morning light became strong enough to obscure subtle distortions. Nothing moved, nothing overt, but I could feel it, patient, deliberate, aware, threading shadows and fog, curling light and air, lingering in the memory of every shift, every step, every careful sweep of the flashlight. And I knew that leaving would not undo it. That awareness, patient and deliberate, had threaded itself into the environment and into me. The shift had ended, but the presence had not. I would carry it with me, threaded into memory, perception, thought, curling into quiet moments when a lot seemed empty, when the world seemed ordinary. It did not need to move to make itself known. It had learned patience, deliberation, observation, and I could not escape it. Even now, hours later, I can feel the subtle pull of awareness, patient and deliberate, pressing gently against the edges of thought. The environment has changed, perceptibly to me, imperceptibly to anyone else. Shadows bend, fog curls, radios hiss, and somewhere beyond perception, something waits, patient, deliberate, aware. I left the checkpoint behind, but I did not leave the presence. It had marked the lot, the fog, the shadows, and it had marked me. And I knew it would be waiting the next night, curling patiently, deliberately, threading itself into perception again. Because some things don't need to strike to be dangerous. Some things only need to exist. Patient, deliberate, observing, waiting. The night felt heavier than usual from the moment I started my final patrol. There was a stillness in the air that wasn't quiet. It was a kind of silence that presses against your ears and chest, the kind that feels like it's listening. I climbed into the cruiser, radio static humming softly, lights casting pale streaks across the empty streets. It was supposed to be routine. The last shift before dawn always was. A final sweep before the night gave way to day. But tonight, something felt off. I started with the usual rounds, passing the cracked pavement of the industrial district, the deserted storefronts, the distant hum of the street lamps struggling to stay lit. Everything was as it should be. Routine, safe, and then the radio crackled, faint but sharp enough to make me jolt. Dispatch copy, a voice hissed, urgent, breaking through the static. I grabbed the receiver. This is officer, go ahead. Silence, just static. I leaned closer, thinking it was Apache's signal, and then the faint sound of someone breathing came through. Not just a breath, but a long, deliberate inhale, as if someone were right there, holding back a scream or a word they weren't allowed to speak. And then, nothing. I frowned. Dispatch, are you receiving me? Still nothing. Just a hiss of white noise and the faint echo of that single, drawn-out breath. My chest tightened. I told myself it was just interference. Maybe a prank, maybe a miscommunication. But my gut told me otherwise. Something was wrong. I drove slowly, flashlights sweeping across the abandoned lots and cracked pavement. The fog had rolled in again, subtle but persistent, curling around street signs and fences, softening edges, swallowing distance. My headlights cut a narrow path through the gray. But even in that beam, shapes seemed to flicker at the edges. Every time I glanced away, the shadows seemed to stretch, linger longer than they should. The radio crackled again, more urgently this time. Words? Perhaps. Hard to make out, like a half-formed sentence being torn apart midair. Help, don't find. The phrases were broken, distorted, but urgent. I gripped the wheel tighter, pulse picking up. Something wasn't right. I stopped the car in the middle of the lot to scan the area. Empty streets. No movement. No figures. Not a single car. Not a stray animal. Nothing. But the feeling persisted. Pressure along the back of my neck. Prickling in my skin. A whisper of awareness threading through my senses. Patient. Observing. I tried to call in dispatch. I'm seeing, but my voice was cut off by static. A low hiss ran through the speaker, almost like a sigh. I pressed the button again, repeated myself, but the static stayed. And then the radio burst into sound. Garbled, urgent, voices layered on top of each other. So quickly I couldn't separate them. Some shouted, some moaned, some whispered, and then, abruptly, silence. I sat back in the seat, trying to breathe steadily. The fog outside swirled softly, curling in strange shapes at the edge of my headlights. I told myself it was tired eyes, overactive imagination, the cumulative stress of long night shifts. But rational thought didn't quiet the unease threading through my chest. I move again, follow my patrol route, try to act normally. And then it happened. Another call, another crackle on the radio. Only this time it was clearer, more distinct. A voice, trembling, almost human. Help, please, behind them. I froze, turned the car slowly in every direction. The streets were empty. Nothing moved. No one was there. I pressed the microphone. Where are you? Who is this? Static, then that breath again. Long, drawn, deliberate, and then silence. I drove onward, tighter grip on the wheel, pulse hammering. The fog thickened, winding around the corners of buildings, curling up stairwells and fire escapes. Shapes seemed to shift at the edges of my headlights, forming and dissolving like smoke. My radio crackled again, this time faster, louder, urgent voices layering over one another. Distorted words I could almost catch. Leave, can't see, find. I told myself to stay calm, rational. No one had actually called in distress. The radios were acting up. Interference. Overactive imagination. Fatigue. And yet, every time I passed a corner, a street, a shadowed alley, it felt like someone was there just beyond perception. Patient. Deliberate. Observing. At one point, I stopped at an intersection, the fog curling thickly around the streetlights, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the mist. Motionless, featureless, distant. I blinked and it vanished. Just the empty street remained, pale and quiet. My chest tightened, a cold sweat forming along my spine. Another call crackled in. I raised the receiver. Dispatch. Static, then a voice clearer, deliberate, speaking a single word that sent a shiver straight through me. Watching. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move, to continue the route, flashlights sweeping every inch of ground. Shadows bent and curled oddly at the edges of the fog. Shapes flickered where there should have been nothing. The night stretched endlessly, each call on the radio more urgent, more fractured than the last. Words I couldn't piece together threaded into my mind like half-formed warnings. Behind, don't leave, follow. Every instinct told me to leave, to retreat, to call for backup. But the lot, the streets, the checkpoints, I had to finish. I had to complete the patrol. I had to observe, to document, to survive. And so I drove slowly, scanning, listening, heart hammering with every crackle and distorted phrase. By the final stretch of patrol, the radio calls became almost constant. Multiple voices layered together, urgent, pleading, chaotic. Some calls were coherent enough to catch fragments. They're behind you. Don't turn. Can't see. Help, please. I pressed the microphone desperately, tried to respond, but only static answered. My headlights caught movement at the edge of an alley. Just a flicker, almost imperceptible. I froze. Something was there, patient, deliberate, just beyond reach. My flashlight swept across the lot, across fences and fire escapes. Shadows seemed to move independently of any physical source, curling and stretching unnaturally. The radio burst into urgent whispers again, threading into perception, and then, abruptly, silence. No static, no voices, nothing. Only the heavy, curling fog, the subtle bend of shadows, the quiet awareness that something had been there, observing, following, marking me throughout the shift. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to shake off the tension. The patrol was over. I had finished the final route. No visible threats remained. But the unease didn't leave. The air carried subtle distortions. The curl of fog in impossible ways. The bend of shadow at impossible angles. The radio was quiet. Yet I felt the threads of those urgent voices lingering in my mind. Patient, deliberate, observing, marking, waiting. I returned the cruiser to the checkpoint, leaving the lot behind. Headlights sweeping the fog one last time. Empty streets, silent alleys, no figures. And yet, the awareness pressed gently at the edges of thought, curling around perception, threading subtly into memory. The calls, the voices, the frantic urgency, none of it had come from anyone alive. And still, it had followed me through the night. Even now, hours later, I can feel in the spaces between sounds, in the way shadows curl oddly in my apartment, in the subtle weight behind my eyes when I close them. Patient, deliberate, observing. And I know that it will be back on the next shift, threading into the fog, the shadows, the distorted voices, and marking the path once again. I finished my patrol. The streets were empty. The calls had no source. Yet, I did not feel alone. Not for a moment. Because some presences do not need form, do not need shape. They exist in the threads of perception, the curl of shadows, the hiss of static. And tonight, one such presence had followed me. Patient, deliberate, waiting. After the previous night's patrol, sleep had been elusive. Even when I finally closed my eyes, I could feel it. An almost imperceptible weight pressing at the edges of my mind, curling into my thoughts like smoke drifting through a cracked window. I told myself it was fatigue, the residue of tension, or maybe just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had followed me last night. Patient, deliberate, observing, and I couldn't shake it. I arrived for my next shift early, trying to gather my wits before stepping back into the lot. The fog had returned, curling lazily around the perimeter, muffling distant sounds, thickening every shadow. I checked the radios first, half expecting static or garbled voices, half hoping for nothing. The air was quiet, too quiet, that quiet that presses against your ears, making every breath seem loud, every heartbeat too loud in the skull. As I walked the perimeter for my first round, I began to notice it, the subtle details I might have missed before. A gate latch slightly shifted from its usual position, though I had checked it last night. A trash can have been nudged a few inches to the left. Nothing that screamed danger, but enough to trigger that prickling awareness. The sensation of being watched. That weight in the air, soft but insistent. I shook my head, forcing my thoughts back to routine. Lights, fences, cameras. Checkpoints 1, 2, and 3. Everything familiar. But familiarity offered little comfort. Each step I took seemed heavier, as if the fog itself weighed down the asphalt. I swept the flashlight across the empty lot. Shadows curled in unnatural angles, bending around corners that should have been straight. My stomach knotted. I approached the first corner of the lot near the storage containers. The flashlight beam caught a fleeting motion, something slipping behind a container, so fast that I barely saw it. I froze, waited. The beam searched the area again. Empty, nothing, just fog curling lazily around steel edges. But my mind would not release it. That fleeting glimpse, impossible to identify, left a residue of fear. Patient, deliberate, observing. I resumed the patrol, careful not to let the dread slow my steps, careful to breathe steadily. And then it started, the subtle movement of objects that should have remained still. A clipboard on the desk inside the hut, tilted slightly from where I had left it. A broom leaning against a wall, now resting at an odd angle. A door that had been fully closed, now ajar. A faint gap through which the fog could curl. Each shift in the environment was minor, almost imperceptible but cumulative, enough to suggest someone or something was here, moving quietly, deliberately, without sound. I tried to rationalize it. Drafts, old buildings, faulty hinges, but the rational explanations rang hollow. Nothing about the weight in the air, the tension curling in my chest, or the subtle distortions of my vision felt accidental. I realized that I was no longer patrolling the lot. The lot was patrolling me, observing, waiting, calculating. My flashlight caught another flicker of movement near the far fence line. I swung the beam slowly, carefully, every muscle coiled tight. Nothing, but I felt it, an awareness just beyond reach, brushing the edges of my perception like a cold finger tracing my spine. I told myself I was imagining it. I repeated it aloud, softly, though the words offered little comfort. It's nothing. It's just shadows. I'm fine. And yet, the shadows seemed to bend differently tonight, curling unnaturally around light posts, pooling more densely in corners that should have been empty. The fog shifted as if directed by some unseen hand, threading through broken fences and weeds and patterns that made no sense. My pulse quickened. I felt the pressure at the back of my neck again, soft, insistent, impossible to ignore. As I moved closer to the checkpoint hut, I realized the pattern was deliberate. Objects weren't just shifting. They were arranging themselves subtly to catch my attention, to remind me that I was not alone. My pen had rolled from the desk into a corner I had just checked. A chair was now angled slightly toward the door when it had been facing the wall. Every detail was minor, but together they created a sensation of being circled, encircled, observed. I checked the cameras again, scanning for any irregularity, any figure that might explain these subtle disturbances. Monitors flickered, showing familiar angles of empty asphalt, fence lines, and storage containers. And yet, for a moment, one frame made my breath catch. A shadow bent unnaturally around the corner of a building, lingering just out of direct line of sight. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Nothing, but the imprint of the image stayed, curling into thought, patient, deliberate, observing. I forced myself to step outside again for a full sweep of the lot. Flashlight beams slicing through the fog, sweeping across familiar corners and distant edges. And I noticed it. The fog seemed to gather more densely wherever I walked, curling in unnatural ways, almost guiding my movement, creating a corridor that led me precisely where it wanted. I swallowed hard, trying to calm the tightening of my chest. The subtle shifts continued. A clipboard nudged slightly again as I passed the hut. A door I was certain I had left closed, now ajar. A chair angled toward me, though I hadn't touched it. The awareness that threaded through these movements pressed more heavily against perception. I realized I could feel the pattern as much as see it, the deliberate intent behind each minor disruption. Something wanted me to know it was there, watching, following, patient. I rounded the corner toward the far storage units, flashlight scanning for any sign of motion. And then, faintly, a sound, a scuff, almost imperceptible, like a foot brushing the gravel, deliberately quieted. I froze, holding my breath, every muscle coiled, senses heightened. Another scuff, then silence. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight, and I realized it wasn't just sound. It was presence. Something that didn't need to move openly, that didn't need shape, that only needed awareness. I moved slowly, deliberately, my flashlight cutting narrow slices through fog. Objects continued to shift subtly as I passed. A broom leaning differently, a pen rolling, a chair angling just so. I felt it circling, threading through the environment, patient, deliberate, observing. The lot itself seemed to breathe with it, the fog curling unnaturally, shadows pooling in impossible angles. Every detail was amplified, every minor irregularity threading into the sense that I was being followed. By the end of the patrol, I was hyper-aware of every footstep, every whisper of air, every flicker of shadow. Nothing moved overtly. Nothing struck suddenly, and yet the weight of observation was relentless. The subtle shifts in the environment, the objects, the fog, the shadows, made it impossible to relax. I realized that I was no longer merely observing the lot. The lot, the presence, had observed me, every corner, every angle, every shadow threaded into a silent choreography I could feel but not see. Returning to the hut, I tried to steady my hands and breathe normally. Notes in the logbook seemed trivial, almost meaningless, compared to the intensity of the sensation curling in my chest. Every object, every shadow, every whisper fog had been deliberate. Someone or something had been there, patient, deliberate, aware. It did not need shape, did not need voice. It only needed persistence, and I felt its persistence in every nerve ending, in every edge of perception. I checked the radios one last time. Silence. No calls, no static, nothing. Yet the memory of voices from previous nights lingered, threading into thought. I knew that even if the devices failed, even if the fog dispersed or shadows aligned with ordinary physics, the presence would remain, patient, deliberate, observing, threaded into the environment, into perception, and now, inevitably, into me. As the shift ended, I left the lot slowly, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the curling fog. Every corner seemed to watch, every shadow lingered, every object subtly rearranged. I glanced back once. Nothing moved, but I knew better. Something had followed, patient, deliberate, observing. It had marked the space, the objects, and now me. And I knew that when I returned tomorrow night, it would be waiting for the next shift, ready to thread shadows and objects, whispers and fog, into subtle reminders that I was never alone. Because some presences do not need form. They do not need sound. They only need patience, deliberation, observation. And I was already marked. The sunrise should have been comforting. Warm light spilling across cracked asphalt. Fog dissipating into golden haze. Shadows shrinking into corners. By rights, I should have felt relief. The night, after all, had ended. The patrol was over. And yet, as I stepped out of the cruiser, the sunlight felt wrong, filtered, muted, as though the world itself were slightly distorted, holding back some truth. I ran my hand over the steering wheel, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the previous hours. My body still hummed with adrenaline, every nerve ending alert, every breath measured. The lot was quiet, as it should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't empty. Not really. That patient, deliberate awareness I felt during the night, threading through fog, shadows, and subtle movements, seemed to have settled into the light, embedded in corners and edges I should have trusted. I walked slowly toward the hut, sunlight spilling across the cracked windows. The logs from last night's patrol sat neatly on the desk, but the objects around them seemed slightly off. The pen I had left standing upright now lay flat. A chair leaned at an odd angle. I could have convinced myself it was careless placement, fatigue, forgetfulness, but the moment I saw it, that prickling awareness returned. Patient, deliberate, observing. I stepped outside again, scanning the lot under the brightening sky. Empty asphalt, a few scattered weeds, the occasional piece of trash. Nothing should have been threatening, and yet every detail was heavy. Each shadow, though shorter and less defined in sunlight, seemed denser than it should be. The lines between light and dark were subtly wrong, curling in a way that didn't match reality. And beneath it all, I felt the weight of last night, pressing through memory, pressing into my perception. I tried to shake it, focusing on routine, checking gates, fences, cameras. Everything worked normally. Cameras showing empty lots, distant fences, and the far storage containers. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet the subtle distortions remained. A board leaning slightly, a shadow curling oddly around a light post. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the insistence of awareness threading through everything. I could feel it, a presence that had shifted into memory, into perception, into thought. By mid-morning, sunlight fully broke over the horizon. The fog had lifted entirely, and the warmth should have been soothing, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe it. Maybe the night had been overactive imagination, Maybe the objects had shifted due to wind or careless hands. Maybe the shadows had only seemed wrong because I was tired, jumpy. Maybe. And yet, every time I turned my head, every time I walked past a corner or a doorway, I felt it. The subtle weight, the lingering presence. Patient, deliberate, observing. I began to notice minor irregularities that weren't there last night. A scrap of paper I had left fluttering in the wind. A chair angled subtly toward me as though it had followed my path. Faint depressions in gravel where no one could have walked. Nothing overt, nothing threatening, but persistent. I tried to focus on the mundane. Checked the storage containers, inspected the fencing, made notes in my logbook. But each task felt hollow, mechanical. My mind kept drifting back to last night's patrol, to the whispers on the radio, to the subtle movement of objects, to the shapes in fog that had shifted too fast for the eye to catch. And now, in daylight, the impressions lingered, more psychological than physical, but no less real. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, startling me more than it should have. My hand shot to the flashlight, though I didn't need it. Shadows fell differently under sunlight, but my mind still traced the familiar movements, the patterns I had learned to notice in the dark. Every edge of light, every angle of shadow carried suggestion, possibility, of observation. I stepped toward the far lot again, trying to convince myself that nothing could be following me now. The morning air was clear, the streets and asphalt brightened. And yet, when I passed the storage units, I noticed subtle anomalies I hadn't before. Dust displaced in unnatural patterns. A door handle slightly shifted, and a board leaning at an angle that mirrored the exact movement of my flashlight beam. That pattern, the deliberate alignment, was unmistakable. Patient, deliberate, observing. I took a deep breath and tried to leave the lot entirely, telling myself the sun was a shield, a barrier to the night's lingering presence. I started the cruiser and drove slowly, scanning the environment with daylight eyes. And yet, the unease didn't leave. Every corner seemed slightly darker than it should be. Every object subtly misplaced. Every edge of shadow curling unnaturally. Following the edges of my perception, I realized then that the presence didn't require darkness or fog. It only required awareness. And it had it. Back at the checkpoint, I tried to settle into the routine of day shift documentation. Reports, logs, camera checks. All normal. And yet, the feeling persisted, like a whisper at the edge of thought. I could feel eyes, not literal eyes, but the sense of something deliberate, observing, threading through perception. The morning light offered no safety, no reprieve. It only revealed that awareness could persist independent of form, independent of shadow. I noticed small details that made my chest tighten. A pen slightly tilted on the desk, footprints in the gravel that hadn't been there before, a slight tilt of a chair as if it had moved itself in the last moments. My pulse quickened, not with fear of overt danger, but with the realization that the night's events were not over. They had simply shifted. The horror was no longer physical. It had become psychological, threaded into the environment, into perception, into memory. I left the lot for a brief break, hoping movement and distance might offer some clarity. Sunlight washed the streets, brightening pavement and asphalt, revealing everything in stark detail. But clarity never came. Every straight line, every clean angle, every familiar shape carried subtle wrongness. I couldn't place it exactly, but the awareness persisted. Patient, deliberate, observing. When I returned, I noticed again the minor shifts, a board leaning differently, a scrap of paper fluttering inexplicably, shadows curling in the corner of a building. My flashlight and patrol route were unnecessary now. The observation existed independent of tools or motion. It had threaded into memory and perception itself. I realized then that the terror didn't end with night. It was no longer about fog, shadows, or subtle movement of objects. It had become embedded in my mind, in the expectation of presence, in the awareness of something that watched relentlessly without form. I tried to write it off as paranoia, exhaustion, or overactive imagination. I tried to tell myself that daylight would heal the fear, that morning sunlight could banish the lingering weight. But each glance across the lot, each turn of the head, each subtle shift in perception reminded me it had not left. It did not need darkness. It did not need fog. It only needed persistence, awareness, observation. As the day wore on, I began to notice the deeper effects. My thoughts kept circling, obsessively, unnaturally. Every memory from last night threaded itself into present perception. Minor movements became signs of intent. Shadows became patterns. Objects became communication. And I realized that the terror had not been in the lot, in the fog, or in the shadows. It had always been in me. Or perhaps it had always found a way to reach me. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't focus entirely on routine checks. Every corner of the lot seemed subtly wrong. Every object seemed placed deliberately. I walked slowly, scanning carefully, noting minor inconsistencies in dust, footprints, shadows, and angles. Patient, deliberate, observing. It was there in every edge of vision, every perception, every thought. And then the sun dipped slightly, the warm light turning softer, the shadows growing longer. I knew with certainty that night would come again, and with it, the patrol, the whispers, the subtle movements, the patient observation. But I also knew that daylight offered no real reprieve. The presence had shifted, integrated into memory and perception, threading itself into thought. It did not need form. It did not need shape. It only needed attention. As I left the lot at the end of my shift, the sun high and bright, I felt the weight of awareness pressing along the edges of thought. It followed me, not in physicality, but in perception. Subtle, deliberate, inescapable. Shadows bent differently. Objects seemed slightly displaced, and every step felt measured, anticipated. The day had ended. The sun had risen, but the terror remained, not as shape or voice, but as subtle, persistent dread threading through awareness itself. I knew it would continue, waiting through daylight, waiting for night, observing, patient, deliberate, and I knew I could never truly escape it.